My name is Andrew Collins. I am a science and history writer. So if you created a stone form that was the shape of a human being, it was believed that that could be inhabited by a spirit that could talk to you. So the bird itself is protecting and guarding the soul. One of the other main functions of Göbekli Tepe is easy access into the sky world. The snake of the Garden of Eden is a memory of that Milky Way, the cosmic serpent itself. The space shuttle missions have all reported these objects that manifest in the presence of the spacecraft. These people didn't go somewhere else for 3 hours. They were taken out of normal space-time. Now we have this scientific basis for the idea that plasma could be the key to understanding UAP. There is an intelligence, a genuine intelligence behind the crop circle creation, but it needs us to do its work on its behalf.
Why don't you just quickly introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay. Yes, my name is Andrew Collins. I am a science and history writer and the author of a large number of books that challenge the way we see the past. Everything from ancient Egypt to Atlantis to the origins of civilization. I've also done books on UFOs, plasma intelligences, crop circles, and as I say, Egypt as well. I've done 3 books specifically all about Egypt, that have been well received. So quite a wide net.
Yeah, for sure. You're into all the cool stuff, man. Yeah. That's cool. Crop circles. I'm fascinated by crop circles. I haven't really talked to anybody about those yet.
Yeah.
But we'll get into that maybe a little bit later. Yeah. But yeah, why don't we start with the area that you... how many books have you written, I guess, first off?
Well, I always say that I've written about 15, but I've been saying that for the last 10 years, so it must be a lot more than that by now.
Okay.
I started writing serious books in the 1980s, and from that point onwards, I've never stopped until now. And don't intend to, really.
Yeah. Much of a social media presence? What's your...
Yeah. I mean, my website's andrewcollins.com, and all of the links through to social media, and obviously YouTube are on there.
Yep.
So, that's
cool.
Where to look.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, cool. Well, let's start with the Taş Tepeler region. What's going on there? What's new?
Yeah, Taş Tepeler. This is the term that's used for this high culture, and some might even say civilization, that existed in the area of what is today southeast Turkey from around 10,000 BC down to 8,000 BC. And it involves a large number of sites that are incredibly sophisticated, with stone enclosures, with a large number of what they call T-shaped pillars, on which are carved animals, but the pillars themselves, for the most part, are anthropomorphic. In other words, they are abstract human beings. They've got these arms in relief down the side of the stems. They have like the hems of garments. They have these neckties, which possibly are chains with something on it, and off the end of those, there's symbols. Bull's head or some other weird glyph. And the T shape itself is the head of the individual. It extends out the back. That's probably an elongated head or a headdress that's probably covered up. And of course, the front is the jaw, the jawline basically. And we can tell this from the fact that many T-shaped pillars have been discovered that are not so abstract, that are more realistic in their appearance. And they show human beings. So we know that these T-shaped pillars represent humans.
All of
normally. Well, I think that the idea is for them to have spirit. In other words, everyone that's created has its own spirit. This is something that we find more difficult to comprehend today, because we only give spirit to, animals, to ourselves, possibly to, some kind of discarnate entity or whatever. But in the past, people believed that everything had spirit. And so if you created a stone form that was the shape of a human being, it was believed that that could be inhabited by a spirit that could talk to you. Now, the identity of that spirit would possibly change. I mean, it could be a great ancestor. Maybe it could be a celestial being. Some have suggested the first gods. But whatever it was, that spirit could talk to you and you could connect with it. And clearly, the bigger the T-pillars, the more spirit that they would have. So that in the centre of enclosures at places like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, you've got these huge, great monoliths with T-shaped terminations, and some of these are as much as 18 feet tall and probably weigh anything between 5 and 10 tons. And these are clearly important figures because you would enter into those enclosures, you would walk towards them, and it would be like they were looking down. I mean, there's one, for instance, in enclosure D at Göbekli, that it's got its head tilted down as if like to greet you as you approach. So that's what was going on here. Whereas obviously the archaeologists would consider them simply roof supports. As far as they're concerned, they have no spirit, no other function other than to support a roof. But unfortunately, I think that this is completely, undermining the actual function of these sites, which clearly are ceremonial, they're ritual, but they're also functional in the fact that they probably allow individuals who are entering into altered states to leave, to go to other worlds. It would seem, and we'll obviously get onto this, that they believed in probably 3 different worlds. The world in which we lived in, which is the middle world or the Middle Earth, the sky world, which we might call heaven if you like, and the lower world, which you can also call the underworld. And these are ideas which, from the imagery that you see in the carvings, seem to be present. But we also know that these principles are very important to cultures past and present all over the world, whether it be Native American, whether it be in Hindu tradition, whether it be amongst the shamans of Siberia and Mongolia. This belief in 3 different worlds is there, and I think has been since the time of Taş Tepeler and possibly much earlier still.
So do each of these different sites have evidence of these 3 different worlds in them, or is it something that you just see globally through Taş Tepeler?
Well, I think that you can see elements of it at all of the different sites, and maybe we'll come on to the individual elements. But I think the thing that we perhaps need to focus on right from the beginning is Pillar 43 at Göbekli Tepe. And this is something which is not just probably the most famous of all of the pillars from these sites, but it has so much incredible imagery on it that it needs to be interpreted and can be interpreted. Now, obviously, this is it in front of us now, and you can see that you have 2 areas. You have the stem, which is obviously below the T-shaped head, and the actual head itself. It's incredibly wide, and that's different to a lot of the other T-pillars. So they want to put as much imagery on it as you can get. And clearly, one of the main features of it is this huge vulture with this ball on it. Now, to me, this is what's known as a psychopomp. A psychopomp is an animal or a bird that accompanies the soul from this world into the next and clearly back again. And usually this was, as I say, a bird because birds are connected with the soul. I mean, even in Christian tradition, the dove is a symbol of the soul. But in the Near East, in the past, it would have been the vulture. Why the vulture? Because the vulture was involved with the process of sky burial. And sky burials are where the human carcass would be placed on a high spot, and the birds, the vultures, would come down. They would pick the body clean, take away the smaller bones as well, and then the remaining bones would be collected up and probably put in a secondary burial or whatever they did with them back in Taş Tepeler days. And so clearly we're talking about some kind of journey here. But you've got other features as well. You've got a scorpion here. This was identified as the constellation of the zodiacal constellation of Scorpius as early as 2010. The vulture itself is also a sky figure. It's connected with the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial bird, which is universally seen as a soul bird. I mean, in Europe, for instance, and Siberia, it's generally seen as a swan or a goose. Over here in North America, it's generally associated with a hawk, an eagle, or a turkey vulture. And here at Göbekli, it is the vulture for the reasons that we've said. And it seemed at some point this bird became connected with the idea of taking the soul away. It's almost like when the birds had finished, consuming the flesh, when they flew off, where did they go and what did they take with them? Clearly, they were taking part of the body of the individual because it was eaten. It was now inside of the bird. So I think at some point they started to consider that the birds were taking away the soul as they flew off. And this then becomes part of a much more regular belief system, which you see at Göbekli. But let's look above this for the moment. You have these weird chevrons going from the area of the head of the vulture across to this large wader bird, which I think is something like a flamingo, which even to this day are indigenous to Anatolia, modern-day Turkey. Now, to me, these chevrons, which are both pointing upwards and downwards, represent water flowing underneath and between these series of squares, as I say, going from the head of the vulture to the neck of the flamingo. And to me, this represents some kind of bridge, a stepping stone-like bridge across water. And I think that this is representative of the journey from the one world into the next, probably into the sky world. And if you want examples of this bridge, you only have to look in Norse mythology. You have the Rainbow Bridge, known as Bifron there. You have this bridge in Zoroastrian tradition, which obviously comes from Iran, where it's known as the Shinvat Bridge. And there are other traditions. In Islamic mysticism, you have a very similar bridge. And these bridges carry the souls from one world to the next. But then above it, you have the famous man bags, as obviously some of my colleagues have referred to them. And there are different ideas. Some say maybe they are, stash bags for hallucinogens or whatever. But in my opinion, they're not at all. The rectangular parts of them are almost certainly the three worlds. And the actual handles, which, by the way, are offset to the left. Now, how many handbags have you seen where the handle is actually offset to the left? Because it would make them very awkward in carrying anything in them. They represent the roofs of these worlds. In other words, we ourselves have the vault of heaven above us. It was considered that in all three of these worlds, they had their own sky. In other words, if you were in the lower world and you looked up, you wouldn't just see rock above you, you'd see a sky. I mean, the whole concept of the hollow earth, for instance, which is in many ways a modern day version of this. If you see images of the hollow earth, it's got its own sky. Well, that's what you're seeing here with the lower world. And you have the same thing with the sky world. It's like these people believed that they would be going to a sky world, which would also have its own ceiling, its own vault, if you like. So that's what that represents. And by the side of each of these three man bags are animals, and they represent the aspect of these three worlds. On the left, you have this small wader bird, and this is a symbol of the sky world. In the middle one, you have a predator, almost certainly a panther or leopard, which is a symbol of the middle world. And on the right, you have what is a toad or a frog, which is a universal symbol of the underworld, of leaping between this world into the underworld. And so all of these animals, I think, are probably chosen very specifically because they are able to leap from one world to the next. And what I mean by that is that they're able to go from water to land to air. I mean, even the panthers on the leopards are famed for the way that they can jump from trees, great distances. So, in other words, there's a very specific meaning behind the animals that are chosen to represent these worlds. But what about the water itself? What does that represent? Well, this is not a common ocean. And I mean, these people would have been aware that beyond our continents, was ocean. I don't think there's any problem with that. This represents what you might refer to as the cosmic ocean. And it's out of this which the ancients believed everything emerged in the first place. I mean, you find this in ancient Egyptian tradition, that there was originally this void, the primeval waters, and out of this the first land emerged at the beginning of time. And you find this in cosmological traditions all around the world. It's important to this day. Let's say in Hinduism, they have the idea of the cosmic ocean and the first land emerging out of that. And this is still taught to followers of Hinduism to this day. And I think that this is what you've got here. So in other words, this bridge is crossing the cosmic ocean itself. I mean, obviously, we can't interpret every single thing, but what we can also say is that if you overlay the stars of 9,600 BC, when this was created, it matches perfectly the heavens. The vulture, the large vulture on the head, is the constellation of Cygnus. The scorpion is definitely Scorpius. And once you've matched that together, what you see is that ball on the vulture's wing represents a human soul, an abstract human soul, as a head, because these people believed that the soul,
an orb.
Yes,
it's an orb.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the Neolithic used this symbol to represent the soul. So the bird itself is protecting and guarding the soul, but that ball also corresponds perfectly to what's known as the northern celestial pole, the turning points of the heavens itself. And, in other words, all the stuff is revolving around that ball. And in shamanism, this is known as the hole in the sky. It's the hole that allows us to go from this world into the sky world itself. And to me, therefore, this is some kind of teaching device. It's a teaching aid, probably for practicing shamans who are coming up through the ranks, initiates. This is what will happen when you go out of your body and enter into these next worlds. Look at the base of it, for instance. You have another vulture, and you have a headless individual. So where's the guy's head? Well, that's directly above it, above the other vulture. The reason why he's headless, and also notice that he has an erection as well. This is a very common symbol of entering an altered state of consciousness. You find it, for instance, in the Paleolithic cave of Lascaux in southern France, where you have a birdman that's falling backwards, a pole with a bird on it. You have a large oryx or bull. You have a rhino, and this individual is clearly a person who's entered an altered state of consciousness. There you go. So this is what you see at Lascaux. This is inside what's known as the world chamber, which is the deepest and darkest part of the Lascaux cave. And you can see this birdman. Why is he at such an angle? Because he's falling back into a hole that's just beneath the actual bird itself. That represents, what we refer to as a soul hole, in German, a Seelenloch, which is the way that you go from one world to the next. You need these soul holes. You find them at Göbekli Tepe and at Karahan as like these circular or even rectilinear holes inside these porthole stones. They represent the beginning of the journey into a liminal realm from this world into the next. So, Lascaux, so you've got this birdman. Yeah, there you go. So, these are the soul holes in Enclosure D on the left and Enclosure C at Göbekli Tepe on the right. The one on the right obviously has been broken. And these are generally placed in the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe in the northwestern part of it. In fact, the one on the left, Enclosure D, is next to the Vulture Stone, as they call it, or Pillar 43. So, why is this area important? Well, to me, it relates to the stars that would be seen on the local horizon, because the main enclosures at Göbekli Tepe seem to be orientated northwestwards towards the setting of the bright star Deneb in the constellation of Cygnus, the celestial vulture. In other words, they saw this as the direction that they would go to enter into the sky world. Why? Because Deneb and the constellation of Cygnus is at a spot on the Milky Way where the Milky Way breaks into two separate streams. And in the middle of it, you have this thing called the Dark Rift, which is basically caused by dust and debris in line with the galactic plane. And this has been seen by many ancient cultures as the road or river to enter into the sky world. In Mayan tradition, for instance, it's known as the road to Zilbalba, and we interpret the term Zilbalba as underworld, but basically just means otherworld, or the other place in the other world. And it's there in Native American tradition as well. In fact, obviously, we're talking about southeastern Turkey here, where all of these ideas are also present amongst at least 30 to 40 different tribal peoples of North America. They have the same death journey. And with them, for instance, the either the shaman or the person that's died, literally, their soul was seen to make a leap of faith from this world into the next world by going to the constellation of Orion. And in Native American tradition, it was a particular object, not in the belt of Orion, but in the sword of Orion, known as Messier 42 or M42. And they would go towards this, hit that, and that would allow them access through what they call an OG, which means a hole, a soul hole again, onto the Milky Way. And they would then continue that journey around to Cygnus, where they would encounter a figure known as Brain Smasher. I know it's a crude term, and there's a reason why it's called that, because it releases the soul from the skull. In other words, up to that point, it's still contained within the soul. But at this point, when it enters from there into the next world, it's like the soul is released from the head once it goes into the sky world. And so you've got this in Native American tradition, you've got it in southeastern Turkey, but in addition to that, you've got it in Egypt. In the pyramid text, which we find obviously in the pyramids from the 5th dynasty onwards, there is described the sky journey of the dead pharaoh or whoever is interred in these pyramids. And once again, it's exactly the same journey. You go from this world, you go through this underworld known as the Duat to start with, and then you rise up out of that in the pre-dawn light and go to the constellation of Orion, which was known as Sar or Sahu in ancient Egyptian mythological tradition. And that gave you access to the Milky Way. The Milky Way in Egypt was known as the Winding Waterway. And you would go from there into the northern part of the sky. This is what the texts say, where the soul of the individual, who was now in the form of Osiris, the god, the dead god, the god who is dead. That's what basically Osiris is. And Osiris would then greet his mother. His mother was the goddess Nut, right? Generally spelled N-U-T. And she is a personification not just of the sky, but the Milky Way in particular. And the texts say that the soul is embraced by his mother, and within her womb, he or she will gain rebirth into the afterlife. And that womb corresponds on the Milky Way to the constellation of Cygnus. So what you have in Native American tradition, in Turkey amongst Taş Tepeler, you also have in ancient Egyptian tradition as well. In other words, this is a universal journey into the other world that was probably all over, the Eurasian continent. It was in the North American continent, and it's found. I mean, I've traced it into Mesoamerica, into South America, and it's the same basic journey, really. And this tells us that these ideas must be incredibly old, and that they probably had a shared origin. And this origin clearly goes back much earlier than Taş Tepeler, and it could be 15, 20,000 years old. Arguably, it's 40. Some people have even suggested 60,000 years old.
Can we go back to Pillar 43 for just a second? Hey, Ryan, can you pull it up? What are the H's and the H and the I that are on the right side of that? Because you see that in a lot of different spots. And I want to ask about the handbags too, because you see those in different spots. But let's start with the H and the I. What's the symbolism there?
Yeah, I mean, what you've got at Göbekli Tepe is the makings of a glyphic alphabet or a glyphic system. One that was probably present already in the caves during the Paleolithic period, but is now beginning to develop into a written language. And amongst them, you have these H symbols, but you find them both sideways, in other words, horizontal, and also you have them vertical. And to me, the vertical ones can be seen as the T-shaped pillars themselves, but reflected downwards as well, as if they're being reflected in water to give you the T at the top and the T at the bottom with the stalk or stem in between. And the one thing that we're beginning to notice in some of the enclosures at Göbekli and at Karahan is that they would have contained water in the past. They would have retained water. And when this would have happened, now this probably was, not very deep. I mean, it could just have been 6 inches. But of course, what this would do, particularly in the moonlight or starlight, is reflect those T-shaped pillars, particularly those in the centre of them, down below as well. So you would see them as above and so below as well. But the ones on their side, I think, have a slightly different but connected interpretation. I think what you're looking at here is the idea of twins, 2 different individuals or aspects that are linked together. And if we're looking at them in terms of human beings, it would be like shaking hands. And on the front of Pillar 18 at Göbekli Tepe, you have just this on the actual neck of the individual. You can see these 2 vertical figures that seem to be shaking hands with both hands. In other words, that they're both reached out, and you can see this. I don't know if you can pull that up quick enough, but you will see that this is there. So, in other words, we are dealing with something where we're relating to twins, the idea of 2. Why 2? Well, because there was an ancient belief, and again, this is something that's found in cosmological traditions still to this day, of the idea of cosmic twins. The idea that originally there was a single source, something that may have existed before the creation of the physical universe, but that this then splits into 2 to create either twins or a dualistic principle, let's say black and white, day and night, two arms, left and right, 2 legs, 2 eyes, etc., but that originally everything was together, everything was as one. And that when you look at the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, when you have these twin pillars in the centre, that's what this represents. This is the split from the original source, and the idea of going through those pillars, going through into a liminal realm, whether it be in an altered state or otherwise, is to get back to that primary source, the source of it all, the beginning of everything. And maybe we should talk about Earth and Man. This is you asked me about evidence of these 3 different worlds and what was going on.
Before we go to him, though, so the H and the I that we see is also seen in places like Tiwanaku, right? Yeah. And so is that just? But the handbags are also seen in both spots.
Yes, I mean, okay. Let's talk about the H for a second again. The I, I'm not too sure about. We can interpret that in different ways, but the H itself is something that crops up in various different cultures, as you said at Tiwanaku, at Pumapunka. There, it's part of a building block, and yes, it would have had symbolic meaning. But I think to try and understand it, we have to look at Mesoamerican tradition, where the H represented 2 different worlds with the stem linking the two of them. And this was the shape that was given to the ball courts, where they would have this ball game, similar to a very ancient, rawer form of rugby or American football or whatever. You have these two separate, stems with that are linked in the middle. That was the shape of those ball courts. And this was cosmological in nature and related to the link between the two separate worlds. So clearly, I think that when you're looking at it at Göbekli, you have similar ideas, that you're dealing with two separate things that are linked together. Now, whether you see them as individuals, whether you see them as black and white or yin and yang or whatever, it's about this dual relationship, both in a material sense, but also in a cosmic sense as well. So what else were we talking about? So we've obviously got the images here. Right, now on the left, this is the interior section beneath the hems, each side of the hems of Pillar 18 at Göbekli Tepe in Enclosure D. Now you've got this crescent, which I think probably does represent the moon. Or certainly the horns, which are, symbols of the moon, but you've also got an object above that. Now, some people have interpreted that as an eye. There is a point right in the center of it. So this could represent an eye, but it could equally represent the full moon itself. So in other words, you've got the crescent, which represents the crescent moon, and obviously above that, you've got the full moon, but almost in the form of an eye. But above this, you have these two pillar-like figures, and you can clearly see that they've got beaks. They're facing each other. There's little holes that are also suggestive of eyes, and you have them linked in hands. Now, you can't properly see it, but there is also another similar link about where the beaks are, and this seems to be like they've got both of their hands out, and they're linked with the other person, both hands. I mean, I've tried to, mimic this actually inside Chadley Earth Archaeological Museum, but standing between the full size reconstruction of Enclosure D, to try and get photographs to show what we mean to do with this. But why two? As I said, it's to do with the twin pillars themselves, and it's about the division from a single to a double, to black and white, positive and negative, good and bad. These people seem to believe that originally there was, some kind of primal singularity that then splits into two. And that one of the reasons why they're creating these incredible enclosures is to get back to the beginning, get back to the source, to be able to leave this material existence. Now, why would they want to do that? Well, because they were living in a world where there were animals that could eat them and attack them and, cause huge problems. This would have been a world which was just coming out of a 1,200-year ice age known as the Younger Dryas, which we know now the evidence seems to point towards the fact that it was triggered by a cosmic event, almost certainly the fragmentation of a comet that caused these air blasts that quite literally lit up the whole of the Northern Hemisphere and created a period of darkness, triggering an ice age, this mini ice age. And that ends at 9,600 BC, and that's the precise time that Göbekli Tepe is created. So you have to get yourself into the minds of these people. What would it have been like at this time? What would be going on in their heads? And there's a lady by the name of Barbara Han-Clough, visionary writer, wrote a book called Catastrophobia, which was all about the state of mind of the human race after this cataclysm. And she coined this term, catastrophobia, for the state of mind of people at this time. I think it's an incredible term because it's right. People would have feared every time that a comet came into the sky that something bad was going to happen, possibly even the end of the world. And what I have written in various of my books is that one of the other main functions of Göbekli Tepe and these T-pillared enclosures is easy access into the sky world to deal with the supernatural creatures that were seen to be responsible for cataclysms. Now, what type of creatures are we talking about here? We're talking about tricksters. Tricksters is a universal idea that you have these gods generally in the form of an animal that can be good, but they can also be bad. Here in North America, of course, the main trickster is coyote. Can also be the wolf also. In Europe and in the Near East, it was the fox. And the fox was seen as the trickster, which is one of the reasons why I think that you have so many images of foxes carved onto the stones at Göbekli Tepe. And we know that they were involved with some kind of fox shamanism because so many bones of foxes have been found inside the enclosures, particularly enclosure D. So we know that they were using a form of animism. Yep, there you go. There's one of the foxes there. I think that's in enclosure.
I didn't realize they were finding bones of foxes.
Oh yeah. In fact, more bones of foxes than any other creature, basically.
What else are they finding in there?
Well, they're obviously finding human remains, but not many. Most of the human remains that are being found at Göbekli Tepe are probably secondary burials that are being placed inside the walls sometime after the construction of these monuments. And the earliest ones are dating to about 9,600 BC, like enclosure D. This is enclosure B that probably dates to about 9,200 BC. But they go all the way down to about 8,000 BC. And then suddenly they just stop. And the younger they become, the more simpler they are and the smaller they are as well. Until eventually they're creating these tiny little rooms, which I describe as almost looking like jacuzzis, because they've got like these benches around them, like you would get in a jacuzzi. And you have these tiny little T-pillars that are probably no more than about 4 to 6 feet in height. And they're generally two of them. And they're in like these little rooms. So they're still going through the motions of creating these T-pillars. And as I said, a lot of the human remains are quite late on in the day. They're not from 9,600 BC. They're from, say 9,000 BC or 8,500. So that makes it more difficult to know exactly who created them in the first place.
Does it suggest that the catastrophe happened and that this population of people was still there, still living there, still doing the same thing, but just a much smaller group of people, and that's why they were making these newer, smaller areas? Well,
yeah, I think it was the same people, but this brings it on to who created Taş Tepeler. And my answer to that is that it's a cosmopolitan, venture of various different peoples that have come together to do this. You would have had the indigenous peoples, most of those that would be associated with the mountains, they're known as the Zazians. They would have lived in the Zagros mountains and also the Taurus mountains. You have probably peoples coming up from the Levant, the countries today of Palestine, Israel, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, the so-called Natufian peoples, and they were as far south as Egypt. And we know that there was direct links or indirect links between the area of Taş Tepeler, Şanlıurfa region, and Egypt, going back to 9,000 BC at least, through sites like Helwan, which is within visual sight of the pyramids of Giza, because the tools have been found there that match those at Taş Tepeler sites like Göbekli Tepe. So we'd have had those people. You'd have had other people probably coming in from the Marmara area of Western Turkey and on the Aegean coast. And these people would have been incredibly sophisticated because they were creating seafaring vessels that were traveling from Anatolia to Cyprus to create permanent settlements there. So this wasn't just the odd sea voyage here and there. These were clearly regular journeys that were going between the Anatolian coast and the Aegean into Cyprus on a regular basis. So these people clearly must have been sophisticated. And on top of this, you have what I call the X factor. And I think these are the main prime movers that came in, and they were coming down either from the north via the Caucasus or from the east, again, via the Zagros Mountains. And these peoples were coming from as far east as the Ural Mountains that divide Europe from Asia, and beyond that into Siberia and Mongolia. And that their journey was a series of waves that probably started as early as 30,000 years ago. Why do we know they came from there? Because of their stone tools. You can trace, almost like a paper trail, the type of stone tools that were being used in Siberia and Mongolia anything between 30 and 45,000 years ago. Highly sophisticated toolkit that gradually finds its way all the way down into Anatolia, where it reaches probably about 10,000 BC. So that's actually during the time of the Younger Dryas. And thereafter, you have a series of settlements that are created in the area of Lake Van, this huge inland sea, and in the Armenian highlands, which are just to the northwest of Lake Van. And these are mostly on the River Tigris, okay? Now, these have been explored relatively recently. Places like Göbekli Tepe, Halenchemi, and other sites in that region that are very sophisticated, but they don't have the T-shaped pillars. They have pillars, sophisticated jewellery. They have the Soho stones that we've already seen. And they seem to be the precursors of those that will eventually create Taş Tepeler around 9,600 BC, because what happens is that they seem to be moving westwards into the area of the Şanlıurfa region, and there everything suddenly explodes into these weird T-shaped pillar enclosures, which are unique. I mean, they're only in the Şanlıurfa region, and I mean just over the edges occasionally into the surrounding regions. But this is the only place that they create this. So something very special is taking place in this area. I mean, I call it the first post-Ice Age civilization. My colleague Hugh Newman, who I know you've interviewed, he calls it the super civilization. And whatever way you look at it, we're dealing with extreme high culture here, with technology, innovation, cosmological ideas, technical skills that clearly have been around for a very, very long period of time. I mean, not just a few hundred years, but many thousands of years. Now, what do the archaeologists say about all of this? Well, they think that it all developed on the spot, probably over a period of a few hundred years. But I don't think so. I think that we are clearly dealing with the next generation of something that had been around, and that, in my opinion, for the most part, comes from as far east as I say, the Urals and beyond that into Siberia and Mongolia. But you can also see technical skills coming up from the Levant. I mean, where they were also, let's just go on to Karahan for a second. Karahan Tepe. Here you have rock architecture going back as early as 9,500 BC. And what I mean by that is you have enclosures that are carved out of the bedrock itself, one of which is the Pillar Shrine, which is an extraordinary structure.
Before we get to that, can I make a comment about what you're just talking about? And that is that it just seems so... to have so many people, so many different cultures coming from so many different places, all to one area. And if this was any time throughout history and you had that happening, people would be going to fight each other. You know, they wouldn't be. So you get all these different people speaking all these different languages from all these different places going to meet at Taş Tepeler. And it's like, what the hell are they doing? If they're not fighting, if they're not warring, and it's like, oh, maybe they're doing drugs together. Maybe this is like when we talk ceremony, it almost reminds me. Or it could be a little bit like Eleusis, where, the ancient Greek city, where Brian Motoresco has done a lot of great work on that, and kind of bringing to light that these people were traveling there for psychedelic journeys. And so
I think they were.
Yeah. So,
But I mean, clearly these sites like Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe are multifunctional. one of which is easy access into the sky world. And I think that this is something that these prime movers, this shamanic elite, as I call them, who end up becoming like these bird shamans, literally wearing the cloaks of vultures. They're also snake shamans as well. Snakes would seem to have been one of their chosen totems, possibly the goat, clearly the fox as well. These are clan totems. I think that, so you'd have had different human groups that would have been doing different things, but they would have been coming together at these sites. There's a big difference, by the way, between Karahan Tepe and Göbekli, which we'll come on to. But to me, Göbekli is, I see it almost like a sort of Catholic cathedral, where you have like the main church, you have the high altar, the choir, but you also have a whole series of chapels, that are dedicated to different saints, St. Michael, the Virgin Mary. And it's the same at Göbekli Tepe. You have these dozens and dozens of smaller enclosures that would eventually be built. And I think that people are coming in from probably, as I said, maybe from Western Anatolia, probably down from the Levant. They're probably coming down off the mountains, and they're spending time in these. They're probably allotted a particular room where they do their own ceremonies. Now, these ceremonies, as you say, could easily have involved hallucinogens. Almost certainly they did. But they would also have been for healing. They would also have been for dream incubation, to try and find your destiny, your fate, and to communicate with the ancestors. I mean, this was one of the most important things, is to connect and to retain that connection with your great ancestors. So Göbekli is, as I said, it's almost like a big Catholic cathedral to me.
Except the drugs.
Whereas, somewhere like Karahan Tepe, that's a much deeper thing going on there.
Yeah.
It's almost, I see Göbekli Tepe as like the main big site. And then, unless we find another one that matches it, then that is your motherlode, if you like. Karahan Tepe is something where something much deeper is taking place. You're creating these incredible rock-cut enclosures. I mean, the pillar shrine is, you have these, but what they've done is they've dropped down into the bedrock to leave behind 10 pillars, these almost phallic-looking pillars that are within this room. There you go. There's a picture of it there. And you've got an 11th pillar, which they've brought in from the outside and put into a slot. That's the one sort of just in the middle, off to the right and down a bit. But then, that's the one. But then you have on the wall itself, which is the direction of the hill, Karahan Tepe, which is this limestone hill, you have this huge human head that's about 3 times the size of a normal human head. I mean, it doesn't do it justice with this picture. You'll probably be able to get a better picture of the head itself. And there you go. And it's on the end of this long neck, which you can see here, which also continues downwards as well. And that's clearly serpentine in nature. In fact, there are striations and marks, parallel lines across it that are accentuating its serpentine nature. And it's also got an open mouth as well, which I think is incredibly important, because if you sit opposite it, which I have done, and look at it, the only thing that you keep thinking of is that it's trying to say something to you. It's speaking to you. And you think if you are in an altered state, maybe you've done some hallucinogens, there's no way that that's not going to talk to you. So, if you are in this shrine and you've got these pillars around you, what on earth is happening here? And I think the clue comes from the fact that if you look vertically downwards onto this particular shrine, it's actually in the shape of a snake's head. The whole entire shrine is a snake's head.
Oh, wow.
And the pillars themselves, they probably got multiple meanings, but one of them is that they could even be the fangs of the snake itself. So you have to ask the question, why would you go inside the head of a snake?
Right.
In other words, you've created this room, you're going inside it. We think it did have a roof. It is astronomically aligned as well, as my colleague Hugh Newman will have talked to you about. And why would you do this? Why would you go into the head of a snake or a mouth of a snake? And the idea, I think, is the same as the consumption of the human body by the vultures. You're to be eaten, symbolically at least, to actually become almost a part of the DNA of the snake itself. The large head coming out of the wall is what I'd refer to as a snake genius. In other words, a snake with a human head that's clearly there to inform you, to communicate with you when you're in this state. But of course, the question then becomes, what is this snake? Is it simply a mundane snake, like people see when they're in altered states of consciousness? I mean, I've talked to a number of people who have had ayahuasca experiences, for instance, and one of the most primary things that they will see are snakes. There will snakes be winding around trees or around doorways or whatever, and often they will talk about a single snake that will come up to them, a large snake, and want to quite literally enter inside them. And often people are not expecting something like this to happen, so they reject it. And but the people I've spoken to have said that I think that it wanted to give me knowledge and wisdom, and that I should have allowed it to enter inside me. Well, put this together with the fact that there are cults, religious cults in this world to this day that allow the spirits of snakes to enter inside them. It's there, for instance, in the Vodun tradition of Haiti, where people are possessed by the god called Dambala, and they will quite literally writhe around on the ground as if they have been possessed by snakes. It happens in Thailand as well. There is a religious festival where people, particularly the guys, have these tattoos of snakes put on their arm. And this is done with cigarette ash, interesting enough, and also snake venom can be used. And then the ceremonies will proceed, and they will then be possessed by the spirits of snakes. And again, literally crawl around it on the ground and writhe around as if possessed by snakes. And I think something similar was going on at Karahan Tepe around 9,000 to 9,500 BC. So again, we ask the question, what is this snake? And the clue is astronomical in nature, because next to the pillar shrine is another shrine that we call the pit shrine. And this is structure AA at Karahan Tepe. And the reason why we call it that is because it's got this huge, almost like rough swimming pool in the middle of it. I mean, and I call it a swimming pool because it almost looks like there's a diving board by the side of it that you can almost leap into it. And people have suggested, and I think maybe correctly, that this would have contained water in the past. Presumably for some kind of initiatory purpose, people would go into it, like the Druids were known to go into bodies of water, for whole nights or even days on end to gain knowledge and wisdom. But you've got this pit shrine, and as soon as I saw overhead shots of it in 2001, after the excavations began there, I thought, that's aligned towards the sun at the time. There you go. The pit shrine is the one on the left here, pointing downwards. You can see the pillar shrine, obviously, above that. And by the way, you can see its shape. Look at the shape of it. Look how that is the shape of a snake. I mean, I've overlaid the head of a local poisonous snake, which is the Anatolian meadow viper, which we now know definitely was being used in ceremonies at Karahan Tepe. And look to the left of the pillar shrine. Look at that thick curve that comes away from the pillar shrine. You see that?
Yep.
That to me is the edge, almost showing the shadow of the actual body of the snake, which is beneath it. So in other words, that's highlighting the body of the snake that's curling around the side of the pit shrine itself. And even the pit shrine, I think, is another head of a snake, slightly different shape. And we know that because on the side of the pit shrine is a very long incised snake. The head of that incised snake, which is on a bench in structure AA, the pit shrine, is the same shape. There you go. So on the right here, you've got the head of the snake. You can see it's slightly raised up there. And obviously someone here has linked it with the Milky Way, which is obviously what I've been saying for many years, since 2021, since all this first was released. And that snake there, well, this is the clue. Firstly, the pit shrine is orientated towards the midsummer sunset in 9000 BC when it was constructed. And if you wait for another 2 hours, you will see where the sun has set, the Milky Way rising vertically up in the sky with the dark rift, which we've already talked about, in between. And it goes up to the stars of Cygnus and obviously Deneb, the bright star in it. But right on the horizon, you have the stars that surround what's known as the galactic bulge. The galactic bulge is the center of our own Milky Way galaxy. It was incredibly bright in the past, almost like a light bulb in the sky, and has universally been seen as the head of a creature, generally a snake. And the fact that the dark rift cuts through it accentuates that whole idea that it's the mouth of a creature. That creature is generally interpreted as a snake. So in other words, the snake itself is a cosmic snake, and it's the Milky Way itself. And obviously this person here has tried to show this. This here, I'm not sure, I presume that is the central area of the galaxy, and somewhere here is galactic center, the very center of our galaxy. And this was the area that these people were focusing on. And they were focusing on the galactic center for the simple reason that to them, if they want to speak to the spirit of this snake, they need to speak to the head, because they saw the head, as we've already talked about, as the point of focus of the human soul, but also by virtue of that, the soul of a snake genius like this. So they're focusing on this. Now, would they have been aware of galactic center being at this exact spot? Maybe. I think that they may have been aware that there was some kind of intelligence associated with this area of the sky, and that they would have interpreted this as the place of beginning, the source, the origin of everything. And my book, Karahan Tepe, is dedicated to a late friend of mine who was John Major Jenkins, who wrote extensively about the Mayan culture, 2012. But he also did a book called Galactic Alignment. And it was a book that put together evidence from all the way around the world that ancient cultures were aware of galactic center. It's an incredible book if people haven't already, got onto it. And I think that he is right, that people were focusing on that area of the sky as almost like the source of everything. Now, why exactly they got onto it, I don't know. Let's call it intuition, if you like. But this also corresponded to the head of this cosmic serpent, which was the Milky Way itself. And this was seen to wrap itself around the Earth, the world, if you like. And a good example of this is in Norse mythology. If you can find, for instance, the Norse tree Yggdrasil, the world tree, there is a great illustration that was done of it in the 19th century that shows the world tree, the ash tree Yggdrasil, and then you have the top branches are clearly in the sky world. Obviously, the area around the base of the tree is the middle earth. There you go. That's the one. And you can see there. And below that, in the roots, you have what you would refer to as the lower world or the underworld. Now, obviously, this is very, stylized in the 19th century, but this is the three worlds again that you've got here. You've got the sky world up the top where the branches, this is where the sky world was accessed from, obviously not particularly well illustrated here. You have the middle world, which is where we live, and then you have the lower world underneath. And all three of these would have been accessible via the trunk of Yggdrasil itself. But what you also have here is this snake that curls around the known Earth itself within the ocean. That is what's known as the Midgard serpent.
Where's that?
You see the main mountain in the middle. There you go. Ryan's highlighting
sure,
it
yeah.
now. That is the world encircling serpent. And again, this is something that's universally known. It's there in Akkadian myth. It's there in Hindu myth. North Americans have their own idea of it. It's there in South American and Mesoamerican myth. It's there in Greek myth. Obviously they all have their own different forms of it and their own different versions of how it looks and how it's placed. But it's known as the world encircling snake. And the closest that you find it to Taş Tepeler is in the area around Lake Van to the east, where you have an indigenous, well, you did have, unfortunately, not there now, an indigenous peoples and religion known as the Yazidi, a much troubled culture and religion that exists to this day mostly in Syria, northern Iraq, in Armenia, and luckily many of them have migrated to Europe and Australia to keep the culture and religion alive. And they also believed in the world encircling snake. And what they said was that they basically saw it as like what the ancient Egyptians referred to as the Ouroboros, the snake that is chasing its own tail. And the Yazidi had their own form of this. And what they said was that if ever the snake head catches up with the tail, the end of the world would come. And I mean, this is very interesting because it clearly suggests it's cyclic, it's going round in a circle, and that it relates to the beginning and the end of time. In other words, it probably began its journey at the beginning of time, will continue on until the end of time, the end of the world. And again, there's probably a reference here somewhere to cataclysms and cataclysms of the past, cataclysms of the future. So this is what these people were venerating. And if you want an example of what was going on at Karahan Tepe, look no further than the Delphic Oracle in Greece. Because what you have here is a very ancient religious cult focused around female priestesses who were known as the Pythia, or the Oracle. And there was only ever one at one time, by the way. And according to legend, they would sit over a vent or a fissure in the rock within this underground room beneath the temple of Apollo. And the fumes would rise up from a dead serpent who was Python that had been killed by Apollo himself. That's it, there you go. When he reached this area looking for a place to build his own temple, okay, and he came across this serpent who guarded the spot, apparently. He kills it, and it's the body that provides the fumes that intoxicate the priestess. And then what happens is that Apollo enters inside her, possesses her, and speaks through her. Now, all right, what's our first idea of Apollo? This sky god or sun god or whatever. Yeah? No. The form of Apollo that would possess the Pythia was a snake, because this was the way that Apollo would appear in an oracular form. And I give various examples of this in the book. So she's being possessed by Apollo in the form of a snake. And of course, she then gives pronouncements, and those pronouncements can decide the fate or destiny of kings, of kingdoms, and even the gods themselves. That's how powerful and important these oracle sites were. And I think that something similar was taking place at Karahan Tepe, but on a much more shamanic, animistic, rawer level. As I said, I think if we saw the rituals that were taking place at Karahan, you would probably be looking at people that were in trance, probably covered in white ash and black ash and whatever else, falling about and, literally being possessed and making pronouncements, probably speaking in this tongue, which probably only the attendants could actually understand. But with it was knowledge and information that would help that community, would allow them to advance on the technological, innovative, cosmological level, all these different levels. In other words, continuing on a tradition, I think, that was probably already many thousands of years old.
Yeah. So how much of your thoughts on this, like with the snake and with everything else, is accepted at this point versus these are your theories?
Well, when you say accepted, I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is the archaeologists working at the site. And it's a difficult one because people like myself, Graham Hancock, Hugh Newman, have this sort of relationship with them, which, from their point of view, they want to try and do everything to disprove everything that we say. So anything we say, they'll say the opposite.
Right.
Like, for instance, the astronomical alignments, which are very clearly present.
Are you talking about
Göbekli.
when I think it's the spring equinox, when the sun hits the snake face?
That's the winter solstice.
Is it? Okay.
For the pillar shrine at Karahan Tepe. But you have solar alignments with two of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, which is the Lion Pillars building and enclosure F. But you also have, obviously, stellar alignments towards Cygnus and maybe even other stars at both Göbekli and at Karahan. There's no question that there are alignments towards Cygnus, the Milky Way, and obviously the galactic bulge at Karahan.
So the basic, all of the theory for what was actually going on there is coming from these archaeologists?
No. I mean, what we do is go to these sites on a frequent nature, basically. In other words, we'll go there a couple, 3 times a year. We'll go to Göbekli, find out what's new there. We'll go to Karahan, find out what's new there. We'll go to any other of these Taş Tepeler sites. And remember, these are not in isolation now. There's at least 12 of these sites. The archaeologists predict that there could be as many as 40 of them there.
Right.
Only a few of which are actually being investigated at this time. So our ideas, they hate. Let's just be honest here.
Okay.
They cannot handle it. Yes, they accept that shamans may have been involved and maybe therefore animism, obviously the adoption of animal forms for religious or ceremonial or ritual practices.
What about drugs? Were the shamans?
I think that people like Lee Clare have suggested in passing, and Lee Clare is Dr. Lee Clare is a British archaeologist that's working at Göbekli Tepe right now. He took over from Professor Klaus Schmidt, the German archaeologist that was the discoverer of Göbekli Tepe in the mid-1990s, and worked there right the way through until the unfortunate and premature end of his life in 2014. Klaus Schmidt was a very open-minded person and forward-thinking as well. He wrote an incredible book just called Göbekli Tepe. It was originally in German. It was translated into English. And he was so forward-thinking in his ideas. Unfortunately, a lot of the archaeologists that are working at these sites now haven't got that same vision, I'm afraid.
Right.
They look at what we do and they will try and do the complete opposite. As I mentioned about the astronomical alignments, celestial alignments, in their opinion, every enclosure had a roof, therefore they wouldn't have seen the stars, therefore they weren't interested in the heavens. Which is just stupid because virtually every culture around the world, past and present, has had an interest in the stars, the celestial bodies, the sun, the moon, and aligned their monuments for that reason.
Right.
I mean, this is not rocket science. I mean,
So
this is something
why?
which
Why did
ethnological studies will show. Native American, let's say, medicine wheels, they're orientated towards stars.
Why do they have such a problem with that?
They don't like us.
Yeah. But do they think that the people were just stupid, that they couldn't look up at the sky?
Well, they want to make everything as mundane as possible.
Yeah.
The other thing, of course, is the idea that at the end of its useful life, Göbekli Tepe was buried in a hurry. You've probably heard this idea on many occasions. Well, the current view at Göbekli Tepe is no, they just walked away and it all just fell apart.
Okay.
That's it, which is ridiculous.
That keeps bouncing back and forth.
You know, I mean, yes, you know, some of the debris would have fallen on enclosures that were still exposed, of course, but they had a decommissioning process whereby at the end of the useful life of an enclosure, they would probably remove some of the stones that they believed that the spirit was still talking to them and they could take them away and maybe put them in another enclosure. They probably broke certain ones deliberately. Maybe they were troublesome spirits, but then they would deliberately fill them up and then build another one either next to it or above it if they covered it over with earth and rubble and debris. And at Karahan, for instance, the pillar shrine was very deliberately buried with different layers of earth and stone, including soil that was imported from somewhere else to create a layer of red earth. So this is almost like a human burial. You know, in other words, when we put people to rest, we put them into the ground, we give the prayers, the ceremonies, you know, the funeral service, we bury it up, we put up a headstone, the rest of it. That's what we do as in respect, not only for the person's life, but also to allow them that transition into the next world, you know, heaven or purgatory or whatever belief that you've got. And they were doing the same for these enclosures. The reason that they were doing that is because of the spirit. They believed that they were alive. They had what we would refer to as the genius loci, the spirit of the place. You know, this is something that obviously comes from Greek tradition, but clearly was universal. The idea that everywhere has presence. I mean, a haunted house, for instance, has a presence, you know, identified as you know, somebody that either died in that place or somebody that frequented it during their lifetime, etc., etc. It's the same thing in the past. There was a presence, the genius loci, the spirit of the place. And this would have to be respected and would have to be buried properly. But unfortunately, some of the archaeologists do not accept these ideas. So to them, oh no, they just chucked some soil and rubble on it and walked away. No, I'm sorry, that did not happen.
All the people that overdosed there are haunting the place, and so.
Well, I've not even thought about that actually. But okay, what is an overdose? I mean, what would have been an overdose for these people? And it's what you would refer to as a death trance. I mean, the term death trance is used for shamanism, and most people assume that means that they just lie down and look like they're dead. No. When shamans go into an altered state, they believe that there's a good chance that they won't come back, that they'll go into another world and they'll either be kept there for duties there, you know, or they may have a trouble, they may have, you know, have to deal with some kind of, you know, trickster or something like this. And there's a chance that they won't come back. And if they don't come back, they are dead in the material world. And if they do come back, they'll come out of that death, literally, and then, you know, rejoin their normal life. So yes, of course, what we'd call an overdose today, you know, particularly if it was fatal, is what shamans were doing. But for them, that would have just been a part of the practice itself.
Right. Okay, so yeah, man, there's a lot going on there, and it's just interesting. We're going to keep finding out more as time goes on. Hopefully you'll be able to solidify your theories with more, you know, evidence to support them. I guess the one thing that I'm still kind of curious about is like, so there's been it's kind of like what's been found there. And so from what I've heard, that there's been some stone plates now and a lot of like dishware that's been found there that's very similar to a lot of the things that you've looked at in here.
Yeah.
So what's going on with all that? Because that's like thousands and thousands of years before we thought that people had the ability to make stuff like that. Yeah,
well, I mean, obviously we sit here amongst some incredible vases from ancient Egypt, some of which go back to pre-dynastic times. In other words, prior to 3000 BC, maybe they're 4000 BC, could be earlier.
Yeah.
So we have to try and bridge that gap between the Taş Tepeler culture and the end of that, which is 8000 BC, and the rise of Egypt. Now, let's stick with conventional dates for the moment. I know that obviously some of my colleagues will look towards the pyramids being built, let's say 10,500 BC, but I'm a little bit more conventional. I believe in lots of weird stuff, but I'm a little bit conventional when it comes to the building of the pyramids. But you've got something going on at Giza, I think, as early as 10,500 BC, but it's hidden beneath the structures that we've got at the moment. Yes, the Sphinx would have been there, but remember, the Sphinx started off as a natural monument, what we'd call a simulacra or simulacron. In other words, it was a body with this head with much harder members, they referred to it, that would be sticking out of the ground, and it would have been venerated with spirit again, perhaps as a lion, or some obviously have suggested a dog, I think probably a lion. And so that would have been venerated for many thousands of years. So the Sphinx would have been there in 10,500%, no problems at all. It would have been facing the east. It would have been faced probably towards its astronomical marker, the Leo as a lion or a panther, probably it would have been at that time. So all of this is there. But was the same type of technology available at this time that was at Göbekli Tepe? I think the answer has to be yes. But how far developed it was, we don't know, because we talked about Helwan. Helwan is an incredibly important place. Even Klaus Schmidt himself, the finder of Göbekli Tepe, wrote a whole paper linking what we now know as Taş Tepeler, the stone tools, as we've said earlier, with Helwan, and thus Egypt as a whole. And Helwan is within sight of the Giza pyramids. So the technology of how to create these incredible vases, I think, did enter Egypt at a very early date. We don't know exactly when. And the reason we can say that is because, as you've rightly said, if you go into Şanlıurfa Museum today, you will see these beautiful platters, as they call them, that some of which are about 1.5 feet in diameter. I mean, they're not as perfect as what you see here, but they're coming along. In the what they've been able to achieve, and we know that these date to 9,000 to 9,500 BC, and they were using, hard rocks to do them. Some of them are clearly formed of basalt. Some are what appear to be sandstones. Unfortunately, no paper has been written so far to go into exactly what types of mineral stone that they're actually using.
It looked like limestone and basalt and granite.
Limestone and basalt is the most obvious thing, but you and I have looked at these in great detail, and it's clear that there's other types of stone involved here.
Sure. Same stuff that you see here, though. Same stones.
Yeah, and obviously we know that limestone can be of various different hardnesses as well, as it, eventually becomes something like alabaster through its calcite content. So, quite clearly there are different variations of what here, whether it's limestone or basalt or whatever. So, yes, the technology was there to create these huge platters. You haven't got the vases as you've got here, but we're talking about a technology which could easily be movable and could easily find its way into Egypt. Now, conventionally, the oldest use of megalithic stone blocks to create monuments in Egypt come from Helwan and date to the pre-dynastic period. That's a fact. I talk about this in one of my books. So we know that this technology of being able to cut and dress and polish stone is there in Helwan, possibly as early as 3,000 to 4,000 BC.
So what is it? We've kind of talked around it a little bit, but what is Helwan? Well,
Helwan today is just a big city, basically, just to the south of Cairo. But it was the original place of beginning of Egyptian culture. And it actually goes back to about 19,000 BC, believe it or not. Highly sophisticated tools and culture existed here that continues on right the way down to about 3,000 to 4,000 BC. And what happens then is that the settlements begin to shift further and further north. There's a set of hills there called the Tura Hills, where the hard white limestone that was used as the facing blocks for the pyramids came from. It was seen to be sacred. And this location was the original Heliopolis Now, Heliopolis becomes a city that's just in the northwestern part of Cairo. Yeah, I mean, it becomes this huge centre of learning, possibly even a university, place with all these pillars that are said to be astronomically aligned and whatever. Today, unfortunately, is just a part of northwestern Cairo. But the original Heliopolis was Helwan itself. And this is not speculation. I mean, even people like Zahir Was have talked about this in the books and papers that they've done. So what happened was that the Helwan culture gradually migrated northwards until it eventually came to a halt in the area of Heliopolis, which was in the past known as Anu or Anna. And the An basically means pillar. And although you can associate this with the pillars that, the obelisks at Heliopolis, one of which is still there to this day, this relates to the pillar of creation, because Helwan was seen as the place of creation. It was seen as the place where the first land rose up out of the primeval chaos. And the reason we know that is because Helwan is on the same latitude as Memphis, the old city of Memphis, which was the capital of Egypt in the Old Kingdom times. And it's also on the same latitude as, if you go into the western desert of Saqqara. And this was seen to be the demarcation between Upper and Lower Egypt. In other words, above it was Lower Egypt, and above it was Upper Egypt. Obviously upper because it was the upper part of the Nile. And the important thing about that demarcation is that it was said that not only was this the place where Osiris was killed by his brother Set, but it was also the place of first creation. So it's on that line somewhere. And although some people might want to link it with Memphis, the original stories seem to be associated with Helwan, which was on the other side of the river Nile. That's where it all began. That's where the Tura Hills are. That's where the original Anu was there. In fact, there are inscriptions within the Tura Hills that actually talk about this is the site of Anu. So we know that this was the original location. And of course, the significance of the limestone is it wasn't just used as facing blocks for pyramids, but it was also seen as the symbol of Lower Egypt, just in the same way that the red granite was seen as the symbol of Upper Egypt. And of course, that red granite comes from, there you go. What have you got here? Yeah, you can see Helwan there. That's where it was originally. You've also got the Tura Hills. That's obviously the town of Tura. But between Tura and Helwan is those hills, right the way along there. And so, in other words, the symbol for Lower Egypt was that hard, pure white limestone that came from the Tura Hills. And obviously the red was the red granite that came from Aswan in the south. So, the red and the white is what you will see again and again at the different temples, because it's a symbol. It's a symbol of balance of Upper and Lower Egypt.
Right. Do you think, obviously, whatever these people had in stone is going to survive. So we see what they had. We see all these T-pillars. We see all these enclosures, all these structures. But what do you think they had that didn't survive?
Well, that's a difficult one. I mean, the first thing that comes into my head is obviously the light bulbs inside the crypts at Dendera in Middle Egypt. Those very strange, they look like aubergines or eggplants on the end of these cords that
lotus
seem
flowers,
to be like
right?
electric.
Don't a lot of people say those are lotus flowers?
A whole lot of people want to see those as light bulbs. And obviously, as we know, they've been recreated and shown that they can work. There you go. Now, the Egyptologists can interpret that in some form of symbolic imagery. But the one thing that it says to me is that there's something else going on here. Those snakes inside these light bulbs, if you like, are quite clearly symbols of electricity, in my opinion. And we certainly know that batteries were in use in Iraq, Baghdad, obviously, at least 2,000 years ago, and wasn't just one, there were dozens of them. And these also have been shown to relate to electricity. So I think what we're looking at is a plasma technology that relates to thunderstorms, natural forms of electricity, the understanding that plasma was a key. And this is something, of course, we're beginning to get onto relating to the source of the intelligence behind UFOs and UAP and whatever of that today. And this is something that I've also written about in my books. If this is important to UAP, to higher intelligences and whatever, the ancients knew about this. I have no doubt whatsoever.
Yeah. So what do you think? Do you want to go into UAP now?
Sure.
Anything else to close out the prior conversation on?
Well, I mean, the one thing I think we should definitely talk about is the Garden of Eden.
Yeah. Okay.
Let's do that.
Let's do that first.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Garden of Eden, this is something that we know from the book of Genesis, the first book of the Old Testament. And it was a real land. There's no question about this, because it's mentioned other times in the Old Testament as well, in the same vein as, Samaria and whatever. So it existed somewhere. But where? Well, there are clues. And the main clue is that it said that from there, the 4 rivers of paradise take their rise. And 2 of those rivers can easily be identified as the Tigris and the Euphrates. And the third one is the Artsis River that flows from the Armenian highlands eastwards into the Caspian Sea. And the fourth one is the Greater Zarb River, which also rises in the Armenian highlands and flows southwards, eventually through the Zagros Mountains, and will eventually join the Tigris, actually in Iraq. These are the 4 rivers of paradise, and all of them take their rise in eastern Turkey, ancient Anatolia. So we know roughly where we're talking about. This is the land of Eden. And within this, there are certain traditions, local traditions, legends, folklore, etc., that expand on the story that we have in the book of Genesis. And the most important one to me is from Şanlıurfa itself. This is the ancient city that's only about 8 to 10 miles from Göbekli Tepe itself. This was anciently Edessa in the Bible. It's called Edessa, a very famous biblical city. But the oldest name of Şanlıurfa was Adama. Adama means the place of Adam, as in Adam and Eve. And to this day, the people still tell the story of Adam and Eve in Şanlıurfa, and it goes like this: that God made the soul of Adam in heaven, placed him down on earth at Şanlıurfa, and made his body out of the red earth that's there, still there to this day. And then obviously from the rib, they created Eve, according to the story, of course. So they're in the Garden of Eden. And then, of course, the serpent comes along. Now, bear in mind that the serpent at this point has got arms and legs. Now, that to me doesn't sound like a normal snake. It sounds like a person in the guise of a snake, maybe a shaman. And what does he do? He says, why don't you take the fruit of that tree over there and try that? This tree is one of 2 trees in the Garden of Eden. It's the tree of knowledge of good and evil, okay? So they take this fruit and they eat of it. Now, the first thing, and I'm sure everybody listening to this or watching this is going to say the same thing. We're talking about some kind of rosy red apple. No. The word that's used in the original Hebrew, and please don't ask me to quote it, actually means seed or fruit, and can actually mean the seed of wheat. And in various traditions, the actual fruit is wheat itself. So in other words, we're talking about the beginning of agriculture here. But anyway, so this is the story. Obviously, they then realise that they're naked, they've lost their innocence, and God throws them out of the garden lest they eat of the other tree, the tree of life, and become immortal. So they get pushed out, and according to the local legend in Şanlıurfa, they go eastwards onto the Haran plain. And there they till the land. Again, that's talked about in the book of Genesis. But according to the story, Adam turns to Eve and says, what are we going to plant? And she says, well, what about this that I just happened to have brought out of the extraterrestrial paradise. And she opens her hand and it's a stalk of wheat. And says, yeah, that's a great idea. So they plant the wheat, and for the first few years, there's very low yield. So they're about to sort of give up when a bull turns up, and they realise they can use this bull to plough the land. So the yield increases, and they all live happily after until eventually, obviously, they die, presumably. But what the story says is that each year they kiss the bull on the head to give thanks for, what the bull has given them. So what is this story? What is this bull? Well, the bull is the land itself. If you go to Eastern Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, and ask the people about, the bull of the land, it is what is within the earth. It is the earth itself. And its horns hold up the heavens. And it said that when this bull moves, it creates thunderstorms, it creates earthquakes, it creates volcanoes, when it's sort of shifting itself. And so really, it's a metaphor for the earth itself. So that's what they're kissing or celebrating or, giving thanks to each year, like a harvest festival, basically. But then, of course, the question is, what is the snake? And I think that the snake here is a memory of the cosmic serpent that is the Milky Way, that has been not just venerated by the Taş Tepeler people at sites like Karahan Tepe, but was something that they were interacting with. And its head was the galactic bulge, in other words, the centre of our own Milky Way galaxy. And they were achieving knowledge and wisdom from this, because of the people getting possessed. They were coming up with information. And this was changing their society. And of course, during this is when agriculture begins for the first time. And we know it begins in this very area because there are something like 50 to 60 different types of wheat that we use today for everything from, beer, well, that's the first thing I think of, bread, cakes, pasta, etc., that the DNA can be traced back to a wild form of wheat that grows to this day within sight of Göbekli Tepe. So we know that this is where the domestication of wheat began for the first time, around 8,000 to 8,500 BC. In other words, exactly during the time frame of Taş Tepeler. And the speculation is that it was created to feed the amount of people that were coming into these areas now to make these enclosures, but also the pilgrims that would let's call them that would turn up probably from all parts of Turkey, probably from the Levant, probably from the mountains, maybe even as far east as Iran, would be coming in to take part in these ceremonies that we've already talked about, whether they be to do with hallucinogens, healing, dream incubation, communication with the ancestors, stopping bad things happening in the sky. So
dream incubation? What is that?
Well, dream incubation is something that we know took place from the cult of Asclepius. Asclepius was the son of Apollo. We've talked about Apollo being in the form of a snake. Well, of course, the main symbol of his son Asclepius is the snake. It's the symbol that we use to this day for the medical profession, a universal symbol.
Right.
And people would go to what's known as Asclepians, which were obviously like the temple and the complex associated with Asclepius, which were often probably originally Apollo sites anyway. And they would be allotted a room where they would, spend the night literally and achieve dream incubation. In other words, presumably Asclepius would come to them in the form of a snake generally and give them a dream or a vision about their future life. There we go. And so, there you go. I think there's a snake there. Yes, there you go, on the right. So this is something which, again, I think was going on at Karahan Tepe and was also taking place at Göbekli Tepe as well. But as I said, in a much rawer form. So in other words, the snake of the Garden of Eden is a memory of that Milky Way serpent, the cosmic serpent itself, and the communications with it. And I think the whole idea of the losing of innocence of Adam and Eve is a metaphor for the change of lifestyle from being a hunter-gatherer where you could quite literally do your own thing. You know, you got your own little family, maybe a social group. You go off with the herds on a 5-year journey or whatever, and you come back to the same spot, and then you go around again. And lovely lifestyle, really, other than the fact you could be eaten by beasts or whatever. But suddenly everything's changed. Now you have sedentary or urban environments where everybody has got to live together and do a job which you've got to do every day for the rest of your life, probably. And you've probably got to get up at, you know, dawn, and your sons, your daughters are going to do that, and their daughters and sons. And in other words, this is the loss of innocence. And you've got a very hard life. I mean, you know, you're milling and, you know, all of the things associated with creation of agriculture is really hard work. And there are sites that are associated with Taş Tepeler, like a Şikli Hoyak, which is on the southern edge of Cappadocia, and dates to the same time frame, probably about 8,000, 9,000 BC, where the bones of the people there clearly have had really hard lives, both men and women. So this is the new style of life. This is the loss of innocence, in my opinion, that became this metaphor, this abstract story of God, of the loss of innocence of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
Is there a tie-in between ancient civilization and the UAP phenomenon?
Yes, there is. And I think that it's something that's coexisted with us since the beginning. My journey relating to this begins with a mountain called Gerizim, which is in the Palestinian West Bank. And it's very close to a place called the Kezem Cave. Kezem is an interesting word. It means magic or occult. And from about 400,000 years ago down to about 200,000 years ago was a very advanced human community. And I say human because the meagre evidence that we've got of who was there suggests that they were our own ancestors, basically. They weren't Neanderthals or Denisovans, who, you know, I've also done a lot of work on. And these people were incredibly advanced in the stone tools, the type of way that they were storing food. You know, they've been said to have created the earliest form of canned food. In other words, the preservation of food within wrapped environments where they put within ash and stuff like this, so that they can keep them for you know, many weeks, if not months. And the types of tools that they use are incredibly sophisticated. Plus, in the Kezem Cave, they had what is referred to as the first school of rock, literally. In other words, people would be brought in there and they would learn the skills, and there were different areas for different types of you know, tool making, etc. But the reason why I'm telling you this is because there was a mountain on the horizon called Gerizim that they would go all the way to get a particular type of flint to make their tools, when there was loads of flint around that they could use anyway. And yes, they did use some of the local stuff, but they would specifically go to this mountain. So what was special about this mountain? Well, in the Old Testament, it says that this is the place of God. This is where God manifests. And according to various Hebrew myths and legends, the way that God manifested on Gerizim was as light, what is known as the Shekinah. And so I looked into this mountain, and I found that certainly for many hundreds of years, and certainly arguably back to biblical times, mysterious lights are associated with this location, specifically with this location. Obviously, in more modern terms, they've been interpreted as UAP or UFOs. But so I went there, and I went to the Kezem Cave, and also I crossed over from Israel into the Palestinian West Bank. And whilst I was there, I climbed the mountain, and on the top of it is a religious community called the Samaritans. Now, the Samaritans are essentially the remnant of the original Israelites, because what happened was that there was a schism between the Israelites, and some of them broke away to become the Jewish peoples. The other ones remained in this area, and they're known today as the Samaritans. And it could, because the place is called the Samaritan Hills there. And I went up there and I wanted to speak to, a person of authority, and I ended up speaking to the high priest there. And I asked him about these mysterious lights. I said, are they still being seen today? He said, oh, yes, yeah, they're still being seen. I said, how are they interpreted? How do you interpret them? And he was speaking, I think he was speaking in Arabic to my interpreter. And the word he said, I recognised what it was. It said malakin, which means angels. So what he was saying is that these mysterious lights, UAP, that are frequently being seen on and around the mountain, are interpreted as the messengers of God himself. And I just thought, this is incredible. This is like something straight out of an Eric von Daniken, ancient astronauts book. Were UAPs, were flying saucers, angels seen as, and yes, they were, because here is living evidence of that today. And what I theorized about this is that the people in this Kazem cave were going to this mountain because of the lights that were being seen there. And they were having their own personal experiences. They were probably going into altered states, and they were connecting with an intelligence that they saw as connected both with the mountain and with the lights. And then obviously in much later times, during the Bronze Age, during the writing of the Old Testament, this site becomes the place of God itself. And it's said that once Abraham left Shanlurfa, the ancient city of Urfa, or Ur of the Chaldees as it was known, he travelled south, and the first place that he goes to set up an altar is Mount Gerizim, because beneath it was an ancient city called Shechem. It's modern Nablus in the West Bank. And that God appears to Abraham here and says, this is where you've got to set up, create the first altar. This is where your descendants, Isaac, Jacob, all the rest of it will inherit the earth, etc., etc. So the Israelites set up there, right at the base of Mount Gerizim. And coming forward in time to the time of Moses and Joshua, after the Israelites have left Egypt and have gone through the wilderness in 40 years, obviously eventually Moses dies before they cross the River Jordan, and the Israelites are now under the charge of Joshua, and they come to Mount Gerizim. That's the first place they go to. And here they set up the Ark of the Covenant on the top of the mountain itself, or in some accounts in the dip between Mount Gerizim and the mountain that faces it, which is Mount Ebal. And they carry out this massive, huge ceremony there. And I mean, if you see pictures of this, you can see the Ark of the Covenant glowing, with this light emerging from it. So you've got this connection between the Ark of the Covenant, God appearing as this light, the Shekinah, in connection with this mountain in biblical tradition. And of course, then you look at the Ark of the Covenant itself. Well, what is the Ark of the Covenant? Well, this is, I think, part of the tradition, the same tradition to do with mountains associated with UAP and mysterious lights. Because what happens, of course, is Moses, they're going through the Sinai, and they're looking up at this mountain, which we know today as Mount Sinai, although that wasn't the original Mount Sinai. Let's point that out. That's on the other side of the River Jordan in what is today, the country of Jordan. And they're looking up, and you can see this light up there. So all the Israelites stay at the base. Moses goes to the top. Not only does God speak to him in this light and give him the 10 Commandments, but he also gives him instructions on how he can communicate directly with God by making this box. And it's got to be made this size. It's got to have linings of gold and shaitan wood and all the rest of it. And you've got to have these cherubs on it, and while appear between on the mercy seat. So he goes down and they make the Ark of the Covenant. This is clearly a device to communicate with God in the form of a light phenomena, which the ancients referred to as the Shekinah, almost like the blinding light of God himself, which was one of the most common ways that God would appear to people, as this blinding light. And so the Ark of the Covenant is eventually taken to Gerizim. And according to the Samaritans, to this day, the original Ark, because according to their story, a copy was made, and that was the one that eventually reached Jerusalem, actually remains on Mount Gerizim in a cave to this day.
Still there?
Yep, to this day. And they have this whole story about, the end times and this prophet that will come, and at this time, this cave will be revealed and the ark will come out.
Where's the mountain? Where does it exist today?
Well, if you go to Tel Aviv, there is a highway that will take you eastwards right into the Sumerian hills, and the Mount Gerizim is just beyond that, basically. But it's within sight of the Kezem Cave, and therefore you could say it's within sight of the very outer reaches of Tel Aviv.
And people have been seeing stuff here for thousands of years.
Yeah, and they continue to do so to this day. But, okay, now this isn't just a one-off, though. I mean, there are mountains all over the globe that produce mysterious light phenomena. And one of the reasons for this is because they are often on top of tectonic plates, obviously very major fault lines. And the pressures, the stresses and strains in the earth will cause a process which we know as ionization. And that is the bending of the minerals that will release electrons from their atoms to create two separate things, which is positive ions, which is the main nucleus of the atom with, some of the electrons still there, and then all the rest of the electrons will become free, and these will be known as negative ions. And this is happening all the time anyway, but under certain circumstances, the duress of the earth itself, it will produce these what so-called ionospheric environments, and these will rise up out of the earth and create literally electricity. And these become like tinderboxes for the creation of plasma. Plasma is the full state of matter. It is essentially that which fills 90% of the universe. What we see as material matter is something which is actually quite rare in the universe. Most of it is actually plasma. Plasma was the sole thing in the universe for about the first 380,000 years, something called gluon plasma. But once this started cooling down, once it started slowing down, it congealed together to create atomic matter, and that's where our physical universe comes from. But plasma is created to this day, not just by the geology of the Earth, but also obviously in the upper atmosphere, in the ionosphere, and that these plasma, what they are essentially electrons. Yeah, countless electrons that are contained within self-generated magnetic fields. And they become so excited, these electrons, that they give out photons of light. And once this light appears, bang, suddenly it's like a light bulb switching on, and you have an object, a buoyant plasma or a plasma construct in front of you. And this can alone account for a large number of UAP or UFOs. No question about that at all. And I mean, this is something that has been talked about by UFO researchers since the 1960s. But because the prevalent idea was always that you were dealing with nuts and bolts spacecraft with biological entities inside coming from another planet, the importance of plasma was ignored. But last February, an incredibly important paper was published. It was by a scientist named Ron Joseph, with a whole international team as secondary authors. And in this, and this is a really thick paper, it basically gives this incredible theory that UAPs are this plasma phenomena that exists up in the upper atmosphere and can be and can come down into the lower atmosphere as well, and that it's exactly what astronauts have been seeing since the Mercury missions onwards from the 1960s. The Apollo missions, many of the space shuttle missions have all reported these objects that manifest in the presence of the spacecraft. And of course, these have been dismissed by NASA and other scientists and institutions or whatever. But now there is a thick paper that says, no, this is plasma objects. But most importantly, that they can act intelligently. They have sentience and they can act intelligent, and that they may be what the paper refers to as a form of pre-life. That's the term that they actually use. In other words, it's not biological life, it's something else. And this is
pre-life?
Pre-life, that's the term that they use. Actually, I think it's even in the title of the actual paper. But this is nothing new. I mean, if you go back to the 1960s, there was a theoretical physicist by the name of David Bohm. He worked a lot with plasma and wrote a lot about it in his books. And he realised that it acted as if it was alive, as if it was almost like the plasma in a human body, which is obviously that which contains the blood cells. And so he concluded that plasma was like a medium into which what he referred to as proto-intelligence could manifest and occupy, to give the impression that the plasma itself, which remember is just a whole load of electrons contained within magnetic fields, could exist, like an environment that this form of life could exist. And he believed that this proto-intelligence was coming from a deeper level of existence. And his colleague, Basil Hiley, referred to this place outside of normal space-time as pre-space. Today, the popular term that's used for it is the quantum field, and that this is something that exists outside of the normal three dimensions of space and one dimension of time, in which our own physical reality exists within, but that it was beyond that in a higher level of existence, almost certainly a higher dimensional realm, but that under circumstances, these intelligence could manifest into plasma and thus, in many ways, exist within our own environment. And the important thing about this is that for decades, people who have tried to look at alternative ideas for UFOs, particularly at what you might call UFO hotspots or portal locations, or as the great UFO researcher John Keel referred to as window areas back in the 1960s, that when these locations have been examined, like for instance, there's like Hessdalen in Norway, where mysterious lights, UAP, even structured craft have been seen and monitored by scientific teams since the early 1980s, that these areas are not just areas of very intense geology, like fault lines and stuff like this, but that the objects that are seen are clearly acting in intelligent fashion. In other words, that the objects themselves could be the intelligence, that they are sentient. And I mean, I've written books on this, one of which was called Light Quest. It came out in 2012. And in this, I talk about dozens of different cases around the world where these lights, these objects that have been seen, act intelligently and interact with, humans, basically. And that when this happens is that these objects are not only just curious of us, but that if we get too close to them, the effects on space-time and on our bodily and mental systems completely starts to shift, and that we will enter into almost like a sort of alien environment, if you like, and that from these often you will get abduction experiences. In other words, you suddenly find yourself in an onboard environment, with what appear to be biological entities there, whether they be tall or small or greys or whatever, and that the people will be, the experiencers will be in this environment, and then suddenly they're thrown out of it, back into their normal environment, and hours will be missing from their life. In some cases, days will be missing. And I realised a long time ago that this wasn't simply a case of people walking inside a nuts and bolts spacecraft or being dragged aboard them, that something more exotic was going on. And the reason I started believing this was because I investigated the first ever UFO abduction in Britain that involved a whole family of 5. They were in a car driving along a road on a very short journey. This was in Essex, the county that I live, just outside of London. And they were on a short journey, one that they did regularly, and they driving along the road, and they saw this oval blue light cross in front of them, a UFO. The son, who was about 10 or 11, was in the back seat. He was resting his hand on the passenger seat and the driver's seat, quite excited because they'd just seen a UFO. The other 2 children were asleep in the car, much younger, were asleep. And they turned a bend, the car headlights failed, the car engines failed. They could no longer hear the tyres rolling over the road itself. Right in front of them was this luminous bank of green mist. And they just ploughed into it, and everything just stopped.
A bank of green mist.
Luminous green mist. So in other words, it was like this, unorthodox mist, but it was glowing green. And everything just stopped. It was like their world had just stopped, and they became very nauseous as this happened. Next thing they know, they're 3/4 of a mile further on down the road, and the father who's driving turns to everybody and says, "Is everybody okay?" And they get the affirmative. But what's interesting is that the 2 children are still asleep in the back, and the third one is still standing in exactly the same position. Anyway, this is in 1974, and the people just didn't say anything about this for 3 years, but they kept having these dreams about being in these bright rooms on an operating table, these strange beings doing things to them. And then finally in 1977, and that's a long time ago, it seems like a past life ago, but they contacted a local UFO group via a newspaper, and they put them on to me, and I investigated the case, and I got a top London hypnotist involved. There are other people involved here. The main magazine for UFOs at the time was Flying Saucer Review. The main organisation in Britain for investigating this, the equivalent of MUFON over here, was BUFORA, the British UFO Research Association. Everybody was involved in this. It was a big, big case. And we got the hypnotist involved, John Day, the man of the family. He underwent the hypnosis, and it revealed this on-board experience, quite classical really in a way, where they saw these small beings, but there are also these tall beings as well, like the so-called Nordics and whatever. And that was the story, and I wrote it all up. It was a 2-part thing in Flying Saucer Review. But something wasn't right. Not that the experience was wrong, because these people had lost 3 hours of their life. I forgot to mention that, right? When they got home, they realised that 3 hours were missing from their life. Now, there's no way that once they entered this mist, they could have just fallen asleep on the side of the road, because this is a busy road. And if any car was in trouble on that road, somebody would have stopped and said, "Are you all right?" It just would not have happened. There's no way, the whole family can be slumped over inside their car for 3 hours and then suddenly wake up and drive on. It's not going to happen. And John said to me, "It's strange." He said, "Even though I know this experience was real," he said, "I have contradictory things that I can see in my head. I can see us in the car, and I'm looking down on myself in the car, as if I'm in an astral state. How's that happen?" And then I was thinking about the fact that the two children were still asleep in the back. The third one was still standing. And I thought, these people didn't go somewhere else for 3 hours. They lost 3 hours of both space and, 3 hours of time and obviously 3/4 of a mile of space. In other words, they were taken out of normal space time and were in an environment outside of normal time where, yes, clearly something was going on, what we call it an abduction, but I call it a bubble universe, something that opened up relating to what they'd encountered, this object and this luminous green mist. And I would interpret all of this now as plasma phenomena. And there are various theoretical physicists that have written now that plasma has an extra dimension of space. So that makes 4 in total, 4 dimensions of space and presumably 1 of time as well. So in other words, it acts as a step up or step down into a higher dimensional environment. And these higher dimensional environments we know exist, or certainly theoretically at least, because of what's known as M theory.
You lost me a little bit. So a fourth state of space dimension?
Yeah. I mean, look, we live in a world of 3 dimensions of space. What does that actually mean? It just means 3 dimensions of geometry. Forwards, sideways, and up and down. That ultimately that is the 3 dimensions that we live in, and everything a part of us, a part of physical universe is that, just simply that. Obviously, the time is considered to be a 4th dimension, an extra dimension. But the idea that there may be higher dimensions is something that certainly has been talked about for the last couple of 100 years. Yeah, higher dimensions or extra. I mean, extra is a better term as opposed to higher, because higher than what, ultimately, And now we're looking at the ideas that there could be 11 dimensions that pre-existed everything. This is a part of something known as M theory, which itself is a combination of 5 different string theories, 5. And this was something that was created and written about for the first time in the mid-1990s by a theoretical physicist by the name of Ed Witten. And this is basically what the theory suggests, is that originally there was a 11-dimensional environment, which is referred to as the bulk. And into this started manifesting almost like a balloon or a bubble expanding outwards, a physical universe, or brain is the term that's used, and that's spelled B-R-A-N-E. And this expands out, and it has its own laws of physics, which for us is 3 dimensions of space and 1 of time. But the other brains can exist. In other words, other universes, and they could have maybe 5 dimensions of space, or 2 dimensions of time. In other words, they can all be slightly different, but that they can all exist within this 11-dimensional environment, of which the other dimensions are what they call compactified. In other words, they're all within us somewhere, but they're so small and so ineffectual that we are unaware of their existence under any normal conditions. But the fact is that these other brains, BRANEs, could be the size of our physical universe, but they could also be very, very small, and they can also overlay our own physical universe. And when this happens, the effects of their universe can interrupt and affect ours. So in other words, if you can imagine 2 of these separate universes overlapping with each other, whatever's going on in that one can start affecting ours, and weird things will take place. And those weird things, I think, could involve the appearance of other intelligences, cryptids, warps in space-time and stuff like this. But then eventually these other universes will separate from ours and everything will go back to normal. Now, that might take a few seconds, a few hours, maybe a few days, maybe a few weeks. But the different types of universe can be of all different physicalities, and they can be very small or very large. And I think that what happens is that when we encounter these plasma environments, what we're encountering with a bubble universe is a very small universe that comes into existence for a very short period of time and allows us to become a part of it outside of normal space-time. And then because it's only temporary, it starts to break down and it throws us out again back into our normal environment. And I've looked at a whole number of UFO abduction cases where people have had onboard experiences. And often they will disappear from a spot after they've seen an entity or encountered an object, and they'll be missing completely for days. And people will have looked at that spot, searched that spot, and found nothing at all. And then, let's say 9 days later, they're found at that exact spot, doing what exactly they were doing at the moment that they disappeared. I mean, there's one account, for instance, from Britain, where a Boy Scout went away from his group, I think he was aged about 14, to actually have a cigarette. Obviously shouldn't be doing that, I know. But he took it out of a pack of 5, because they used to have packs of 5 back in those days. This was in the 50s. And he lit up the cigarette, encountered this object, and had this sense of the being approaching him. And according to later hypnosis, he was abducted aboard, a spacecraft. But the fact is that he disappeared, and there was a search for him right the way through until it got dark. And, obviously they were in panic. They'd lost a child. And then eventually one of his other scouts noticed him at the exact spot where he'd been, and he still had the cigarette on. And his friend said, put that cigarette out. The master's coming, the scout master's coming, put that out. Where have you been? And he looked in the pack and they still had another 4. So it was the same cigarette that he'd lit hours and hours and hours before. He'd had this experience, was back at the same spot, a spot that had been searched thoroughly in between times, and suddenly he was back at the same spot. So something else is going on here. There's something that's far more exotic than simply saying that we're being dragged aboard nuts and bolts spacecraft. And I've written about this in various books, but because of the work of Ron Joseph and an international team publishing this paper last year, and he actually published 2, one in February, I think one came out, I think in October last year. Now we have this scientific basis for the idea that plasma could be the key to understanding UAP. And what has helped this was the whole drone New Jersey phenomena that began in mid-November last year, where suddenly people were seeing what they thought were drones in the skies. People were going outside, they were making videos of them, putting them up online, becomes a viral phenomena. And not just that, but it forces the Pentagon to comment on it and say, look, we really don't know what's going on, but don't worry, there's not a threat to national security. And when you start looking at a lot of these videos that are being produced, they are clearly not drones. And they are being described as plasma orbs or plasmoids. And suddenly this whole idea that UAP could be plasma is becoming incredibly popular amongst, literally pop culture. And I love this because this is what some UFO researchers have been saying for decades. I mean, there was a guy, for instance, called Trevor James Constable. He wrote books in the 1960s and the 1970s. The most, not famous because it didn't really sell that well, but the most important book was called The Cosmic Pulse of Life. And he said exactly the same thing, that the UFOs were living beings in their own right. He called them sky critters. And he believed that they lived up in the atmosphere and would come down, and that for the most part, they were invisible to us because they were just outside of the visible spectrum. I mean, some plasma can be invisible, by the way. Some of it can be dense. It can be picked up on radar. It can also act, I think, as a portal, almost like a wormhole, connecting 2 places in space. In other words, it could be used as a portal through which perhaps, true extraterrestrials or structured craft can actually manifest through and out of. In other words, so not only is it sentient and intelligent, but that it can actually act as a portal in its own right, to somewhere else, literally. So Trevor James Constable wrote all about this, and what he tried to do was communicate with them by doing these ceremonies out in the Mojave Desert, where he'd quite literally stand on a hill and call them down and get photographs taken as he was doing it. And he got these incredible pictures of these objects coming down, sequences where they'd actually come down. I mean, I wrote about them in a book called The Circle Makers I did back in 1992, which was mostly about crop circles. But anyway, I could go on.
Do you think that every UAP has an element of plasma within it, or do you think that there are some solid craft?
Well, back in the 1960s, Carl Sagan, the great science writer, cosmologist, astronomer, and presenter, of course, of a TV series, he wrote a paper in which he concluded that it was inevitable that we'd been visited on countless occasions by extraterrestrials. And this paper was buried at the time because he was just becoming very popular with NASA, who he would work with on various projects. And they basically said to him, look, you've got to lose this, if you're going to be working with us, this idea that we're being visited by extraterrestrials, you've got to put to one side. So unfortunately, this paper was buried, but it's now resurfaced, and I've quoted it in books. So he says this. If he says that, I'm willing to accept it. And I think that we have to say that, yes, we have been visited here by nuts and bolts spacecraft, by probably biological entities. But
they don't have nuts and bolts, by the way.
Well, no, but you know what we're talking about.
There's no nuts and bolts on these spacecraft.
Hold on. Going back to the 1950s, the accounts of the flying saucers had things like levers and gadgets and gears and stuff like that inside them. Yeah. I mean, and these were supposed to be craft from Mars or Venus or Saturn, and people were, the so-called contactees were supposedly riding inside of them. Obviously the most obvious being George Adamski, but there were many other contactees, not just in America, but in many other countries as well. And the objects that they were allegedly flying in were very crude, if you like. But of course, as the decades go on, they become more advanced, more ergonomic, more futuristic. In the same way, obviously, that you have, let's say, Star Trek in the 1960s, the original series, everything's, sort of gears and clunky and whatever.
I'm asking about reality, though.
But this it's consciousness. Consciousness is the key here. It's our interaction with this phenomena that creates what we see. Jacques Vallée, for instance, the French UFO researcher, wrote some incredible books like, Passport to Magonia. He recognised, probably as early as the 60s, that there was a relationship between the UFO encounters, UFO abductions that are being reported today and the fairy encounters of medieval times, well, right the way up until literally the 19th century. You'd have exactly the same type of situation, but slightly different. And where people would be, let's say, walking across a field or a meadow, they would see this strange light, they would walk towards it, they would interact with it, they would see the fairies inside it dancing away or maybe eating, and they'd be drawn into this. They would dance with the fairies, they may eat it, and either they would come out of this of their own accord, or one of their mates that knew that they were missing would see them dancing, and they would literally yank them out of this environment and say to them, "Where have you been? It's been 1 year or however long you've." And the person would say, "Well, I only thought I was dancing for an hour." It's the same type of phenomenon. Yes, of course, this is a certain amount of exaggeration, imagination, or whatever, but people in the past were having these encounters with these lights and seeing these fairies or elves or little people or whatever you want to call them, some of which look almost identical to the greys of today. And they were interpreting it in their own cultural folk manner. And there are other cases, for instance, where people have encountered these objects that have come really close, and they're looking at it, and suddenly Jesus is standing in front of them with his arms out saying, "Come with me to heaven." And they're taken on rides to heaven, and they see heaven, and are then suddenly put back at the same spot, and the object's just disappearing away from them. It's clear that the experiences that we have are based on our own consciousness interaction with it, and that this is based on what we expect to happen. So back in the early 1950s, we're expecting to encounter flying saucers from Venus. So that's exactly what the phenomena will give us. Back in the past, it was encountering the fairies, dancing with them, eating with them. And obviously this is all developing as the decades go on. But now, of course, we have this plasma thing, and we're beginning to understand that something like quantum entanglement, the idea of particles being twinned, possibly, no matter how far away they get, they still retain this link between them. This is happening all the time on a subatomic level with the creation of photons, for instance, that they're twin. They have this relationship, this connection, and that it's not just happening on a subatomic level, but it's also happening on a macrocosmic level. In other words, that two things can resonate together because of what's known as quantum entanglement. Well, our whole system works through electricity, basically. Firing neurons, the brains, everything, and that's all surrounding electrons, basically. If these plasma environments are themselves made of electrons, that means that we can quantum entangle with them. They can become a part of us, just in the same way that they can become a part of part of them, part of us, sort of thing. And in other words, there's this two-way communication going on with these intelligences, with these other consciousness, as soon as we connect with them. So that the closer we get, the more that environment becomes interactive, until the point that we enter into these other environments, which, as I said, I refer to as bubble universes.
So all of the UAP, the entire UAP phenomenon, you think that is related to plasma technology? Well,
I mean, a lot of UFO researchers that are looking into this are talking in terms of plasma drives anyway. In other words, that plasma could be the means to surround a ship and allow it to get from one place to another quickly anyway. So yes, absolutely. So there
might be some, not nuts and bolts, but some type of a craft beneath the plasma, or within the plasma.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you go somewhere like Hessdalen in Norway, not only do they see, bobbing lights or lights of different shapes and sizes and colours, but what they've seen is, coming from the lights, structured craft emerge out of them.
Right.
And I find that really, really interesting. And you'll often find this, that a lot of UFO encounters begin when people see a light that then transforms into what appears to be a structured craft. Now, I think that this relates to the fact that the plasma is itself a conduit, a portal, linking with somewhere else. I'm not saying that, therefore, the physical craft is necessarily entering at one spot, coming through the quantum field, and then coming out of plasma at the other end. I think that what's happening is that the plasma, if it is intelligent, it has the ability to transform into physical matter itself. I mean, remember, that's exactly the same thing that happened at the beginning of our universe. Our universe was filled with plasma. That was the only thing that was in our universe. And that plasma then becomes atomic matter. So the idea that atomic matter can transform into plasma, or plasma can become atomic matter, is a matter of fact.
I wanted to jump in and share this video from the Rohan, the doctor there. He put a series of videos together that he got from NASA that shows plasma out in space. And this kind of ties into what Chris Bledsoe said about partnering with NASA and trying to figure out why these orbs are bothering their spacecraft. Now, video's not the greatest in the world, but quite interesting. So this is obviously from outer space shuttle with the solar array on it, and videos that NASA's shared that clearly show, to what Andrew was talking about earlier, plasma in space.
Something in space.
Mm-hmm. and it's about 20 minutes worth of video. That was by far one of the better ones, but they've got multiple documented instances of it. And again, what's really interesting about this is from NASA, not necessarily a video that he created, but it adds to that. You know, when these spaceships are in space, they start to experience plasma that's interacting with them, to Andrew's point, in what appears to be an intelligent manner, and not just random.
Right.
So again,
they're sentient.
Not HD video, but something really interesting that's just kind of out there.
Yeah. There you go. That's plasma. Those are plasma constructs, or buoyant plasma, or plasmoids is the term that's used. And scientists are now concluding that these things are intelligent. Yeah. In other words, they're a form of life that coexists with us.
For how long are they intelligent? Like, can they be coming in and out of existence?
I give an example of how I think
craft,
the intelligence.
Obviously, it's going to live forever for the life. But if it's just an appearance of an orb and a disappearance of an orb, and clearly they can be sentient. They when you see ball lightning appear, they're making decisions and going to specific spots, and then they disappear. But is that the end of it, or
in a way? Because the way I look at it is, if you take a glove, okay, I know it sounds like a weird metaphor, but if you take a glove and you put it down, it is simply a piece of material. You know, it might be made of leather, it might be made of wool, or cotton, or whatever it is, and it's nothing. You wouldn't say that was alive. But if you got that glove and you wear it and you start moving your hand around, the glove is animated, and that is what the plasma is. It's the environment into which these intelligences come up into, and that is what David Bohm said in the 1960s, that the plasma is merely the environment that these intelligences inhabit. So when the plasma breaks down, which inevitably it will, then that intelligence will go back into the deeper existence that it came from in the first place. Now, David Bohm called this environment the implicate order. That's the term he used for it. And he believed that the implicate order is where essentially all life comes from, or the idea of life. So he was looking at the terms that, in terms of this same life that would inhabit plasma environments, was behind the order of creation of life within the physical universe as well.
So life itself could. So if it's an electromagnetic field and it's being inhabited by electrons, and those are the two things that you're saying make up this plasma.
Yeah.
Then any. If a group of electrons is a form of consciousness, say, and that consciousness goes and attempts to inhabit an electromagnetic field that's just kind of it knows that it exists, and then it goes there and it attempts to then it has this consciousness, and it can move around and become sentient.
Yeah.
But I think I'm understanding that. But then you've got these so that explains maybe some of the ball lightning phenomenon, and that could be explaining a lot of what people see. You know, there's an orb entered in through my window, and I saw it, and it came up to me and looked at me, and it disappeared. I mean, George Howard has a story like that. Like, a lot of people have seen ball lightning manifest and do things specifically. But then you have things like people being taken up into these, what you might call a craft or whatever. And so obviously there's a much higher technology there, where someone or some civilization or some group of whatever have gone through the process of manufacturing some sort of a craft that would also have this plasma technology surrounding it that it could use to do things like what? I mean,
I think the problem is that there are blurred lines here now. You know, in other words, you've got, let's say, structured craft and maybe, biological entities, and you now have this plasma phenomena, which could be multidimensional in nature. It responds to consciousness. It responds to what we believe, what we accept is meant to happen when an encounter takes place. And there's this blurred area now that it's almost like the plasma intelligences are taking advantage of the idea of structured craft. So they're building their own form of it to allow this interaction, this communion, if you like, as let's say Whitley Strieber would say, with the actual intelligences. They are deliberately creating environments that we would see in terms as the interior of a spacecraft, for instance.
Right.
And when you look at a lot of these encounters, the time that people are inside these craft are greatly at variance often from the time that they've actually been away from the Travis Walton case, for instance. A very famous case from Arizona, as we know. He's driving along with his other mates. They've just been logging, in a forest, and suddenly they see this object in the tree. Travis Walton gets out, and the term that's used is a beam comes out, but the actual real word was it was like a lightning bolt that came out and hits him, and he falls back. But then, obviously, the guys in the truck go off. They obviously come back. They search for him. They can't find him, and he's away for days. And eventually, he just sort of comes to and makes a telephone call, and he's picked up. But the actual account of Travis Walton, whilst he's supposedly on board, is completely at variance from the time of him being away.
Yeah.
It's not days, it's just an hour, or certainly that's the way that his account gives. So it doesn't really relate to him being on board a craft, sleeping for being fed, doing this. It just all seems that there's something, and the term I use is more exotic going on here. I think that our understanding of, let's say, the abduction experience has been inadequate to fully understand or to interpret what's going on. Now, I am not denouncing any form of abduction. I've interviewed many abductees, many experiencers, and they're telling the truth. So let's make that clear. But as to exactly what is happening, I think that there are a certain amount of blurred lines now as to whether this is something that is created by plasma intelligences for our necessity, or whether we really are dealing with nuts and bolts spacecraft. And I say, yeah, clearly there's no nuts and bolts on them, but this was the term that is, in other words, a technologically created craft.
Yeah, a solid craft.
Yeah.
But even with the one where you see that you mentioned, where the family of 5 is driving down the street and they see this big ball of light, this blue light, and then
oval light.
they're taken up into whatever it is. You've got little creatures and you've got tall creatures in that situation, right? So you're still encountering these quote unquote.
But what were they?
What were they? Yeah.
Were they simply a creation of the environment in which they were in? I think that they were real intelligences, but they could easily have been taken on forms that were acceptable to the circumstances in which this abduction was taking place. And I'll tell you for why. Because these tall guys, when they gave their names, they were all Greek gods. And you think, why would aliens have names of Greek gods? I investigated another UFO abduction where a lady was taken aboard a craft, from a front doorstep, and she suddenly found that these entities. She was presented in front of these entities, and the one in the middle had horns, and referred to himself under the name Osiris. You think, well, hold on, what's an alien doing inside a spacecraft with horns, calling himself Osiris? Something, and she'd never heard of the Osiris at all. And you think, what's going on here? Why? What truth? And to me, this is a product of necessity for the person to accept what's actually happening during these particular abduction experiences, which is why these odd names are given, why there's strange appearances. And of course, we have this idea that most UFO entities look like Whitley Strieber's greys, basically. Yeah? But prior to 1987, when Communion by Whitley Strieber was published, there were all sorts of, hundreds of different types of entities being encountered. In fact, very rarely did they ever look similar to each other. Very rarely. But this was a point of demarcation of change, because what you found is that most UFO encounters after that time involved greys. Now, I know one abductee who'd had an alleged abduction experience before this time, and I actually investigated it and wrote up the whole story. He, after Whitley Strieber's book came out, because of the popularity of greys, he actually changed the image of the entities in his own drawings to look like greys with the almond eyes and all the rest of it. Whereas you look at the pictures before that, there was something completely different.
So what do you think's happening?
I think that we're dealing with multi-dimensional intelligences that can use plasma environments to connect with us. I think that they've been with us since the beginning. I think that we connect with them through hallucinogenic experiences and have done since the beginning of humanity. And I'm talking probably going back to 1.75 million years ago. Why that date? Because that's essentially when we invented fire for the first time. Fire generally lit inside caves, and you'd be throwing all sorts of different plants and wood and whatever to keep this fire going. And it's no coincidence that exactly at this time is when the stone tools that we're creating, which up to this time are known as pebble tools. In other words, somebody's just gone down to the local stream, got a nice pebble, smacked it on the ground, it's pointed, we can use it, to the creation of the most beautiful hand axes, known as the Acheulean hand axe, that are like multifaceted Swarovski crystals. So what suddenly happened, and in my opinion, is that what's being thrown on these early fires inside the caves are plants that are hallucinogens. And it wouldn't have taken them that long to work out that they're going into what we would call an altered state when a certain type of plant was being thrown onto the fire. And in other words, they could then replicate that themselves. And I think that what's happening is that this is allowing them communication with entities for the first time that are instructing them, literally giving them giving them technology and ideas and innovations. And that this therefore allows our consciousness to connect with the locations where these intelligences are manifesting, like Mount Gerizim, in the Palestinian West Bank. So that these people, presumably they couldn't see the lights from where they were, they would be drawn to these mountains like Mount Gerizim, where they would encounter these lights, probably have their own form of abduction experiences. I don't think that they would have been seeing alien greys. They probably were seeing tricksters and animals and, shamans that had passed over, maybe the spirits of the elephants that they'd killed during the hunt or something like this. But that these intelligences were speaking to them, almost like something out of, Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, the idea of animals being able to speak to them and that they would be communicating with them. And these would be these intelligences, the very same intelligences. I think they're of a higher dimensional nature, and they've been with us since the beginning.
And so is it like God, or is it like something from somewhere else, or is it something that's always been here, or is it spiritual?
It's outside of normal space-time. And as we mentioned earlier, the whole concept of M theory and the 11 dimensions gives you these higher dimensional environments where these intelligences can exist outside of us being aware of them in any way. And I'll give you a good example. On Carl Sagan's program in the early 70s, I can't remember what it's called now, he demonstrated how we as three-dimensional creatures would be able to connect with four-dimensional creatures. And he gave the example of a two-dimensional world, right, where you have two-dimensional beings. Now, two-dimensional just means that you can go forward or sideways. You can't go up. So in other words, everything is it's a flat land, yeah? So any entities are flat. Now, let's say you got a ball bull, B-A-L-L, and put it through their world, and what would they see? All they would see is a circle gradually opening up until it had reached its maximum width. And then as the ball passed through, that circle would close again. Because a two-dimensional person, a flatlander, can never see a three-dimensional object because it's only two-dimensional. And it's the same as us. We are three-dimensional creatures, so we will never properly be able to see or interpret a higher dimensional being it's in front of us. We need an interface, and that we get through consciousness and quantum entanglement. And that's how these higher dimensional intelligences are able to connect with us, and plasma environments is the easiest form for them to do this.
Interesting. Have you seen this egg? Have you seen this new, what are your thoughts on that thing?
I just wish I could see more of it.
Yeah. Oh, there it is. Yeah.
I mean, the trouble is you've got this long lead going down to it. You've got it, something covered, it's covered up. I mean, people have said that the grass is too well cut. It's clearly done. I mean, look, there's a lot of criticism over this.
There's a lot, yeah.
I mean, the guy that supposedly was on the helicopter, or certainly a similar one, is claiming that it was a retrieved object. And yeah, I'd love for that to be the case. Yeah. But I really need to see more evidence than that, I think.
Okay, so you believe the guy, but...
Yeah, I mean, look, it's encouraging, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously with Roswell and other alleged crashes, it's so far back that it's very difficult to pick the true facts from just the stories that have developed since 1947. And so I don't think that Roswell is good evidence of a crash retrieval, in my personal opinion. I'd want to see more. But I live in hope that that they will wheel out at some point evidence of a crash saucer. I'd love that. Of course I would.
Yeah. So you do think, do you not think Roswell was an actual crash?
I've written about it in detail, and my honest opinion is I wish I had not written about it. And I'll tell you for why. Is because in there, and it's in my book Light Quest, it's the first couple of chapters of the book, that some people read that and me eventually ending up dismissing it, and they just closed that book and put it down. Whereas the next chapter, you're getting onto all this plasma stuff from a place called Marfa in Texas, where all these weird lights and objects are seen. So it's almost like suddenly you've thrown the baby out the bathwater, so to speak, by putting that at the beginning. And also, there are people's belief in Roswell is so entrenched that I don't think that you could convince people otherwise of it existing. But having been to Roswell myself and all the rest of it, and done my own investigations there, I was not convinced by the end of it. I'll be honest.
Okay. Yeah. What about do me and the audience a favor with regards to crop circles? You've studied crop circles extensively in your life, and so it's always been one of those things that I felt like was a legitimate phenomenon, and so I know that there's some that are probably not, but then there's some that are just completely seem to be totally unexplainable and just appear out of nowhere. And sometimes you see a craft flying over, and then you see this thing forming. I mean, there's some video of that's
a hoax.
That's a hoax, of course. but then
okay. Sorry to
but
yeah.
But is there no video of a crop circle
being made
that's real?
Oh no. Okay. This is the whole book in its own. Right, obviously. Firstly, historical crop circles are real, no problem at all. Yeah, they were known in the past as devil circles. They were known in the past as fairy circles, even though that can be confused with another type of fairy circle that's made from a ring of fungi or whatever.
Going back how far?
Yeah, well, it's certainly at least the 16th century.
Okay.
17th century. And there is the famous story of the mowing devil. And this is an account from, there you go, that was quick. is that this account was given and written up as a booklet in the 17th century in the county of Hertfordshire of this farmer looking out of his window and seeing this light in the fields, and basically he interpreted it as the presence of the devil. But when he went out there the next day, there was a whole mowed area in a circle. When he said mowed, obviously that generally means cut down, so that's slightly different to modern crop circles, but very similar. But what's so interesting about this is that the farmer then became quite ill afterwards, and suffered with a sickness after actually having gone in to this mowed circle. And that's so interesting because on so many occasions, people going into crop circles would have an adverse reaction. Sometimes it was good, maybe they had like a healing effect, or in others, they would come out feeling incredibly nauseous. Now, obviously, the skeptics just put that down to, maybe it's the crop spraying or something, chemicals in the land. But no, that seemed to be something that was occurring again and again, particularly in the early days of crop circles when I was investigating them in the early 1990s. But then, of course, you have to start looking at the much bigger crop formations that are beautiful, incredible. They are signs of transformation, ultimately. And the problem here is that we know that so many of these were done by teams of people going out in the middle of the night and creating them, these incredible artists. I mean, I lived at a place called Avebury, which is right in the centre of this huge, great stone circle, the largest one. And I lived there for 5 years. I got to know all of the crop circle makers, and I was able to have detailed conversations. They respected me because they know I'd written books that were sympathetic to the fact that a lot had been done by human hands. And here's the thing: firstly, there's no question that they were making them. You'd go into a pub, for instance, and you'd see 3 teams, as many as 3 teams, waiting to go out to do the crop circles, waiting for it to get dark enough for them all to go out. Also, they would show you what they were about to do.
Totally understand there's fake crop circles, but what about the real one? My question was to convince me that crop circles are real.
Well, the problem is with the term real, real is in the minds of the people that inspect them afterwards, whether they like them or not.
Or whatever. You know what I mean, though. Well, right? Like the ones that are not made by humans.
I mean, look, if you want to go into a huge, great field in the middle of Canada, for instance, where where they don't use these what they call tram lines, to allow tractors access, for spraying or whatever else it is. Yeah, I mean, those type of crop circles are probably real. Also, we know that there were real ones in New Zealand, for instance, going all the way back to the 1960s. And some of those would have rings around them or spurs coming off of them. I'm pretty certain these were genuine. Then, of course, you've got the whole idea of so-called saucer nests. These were these circular depressions that were left behind after people saw a UFO or flying saucer coming down and then depart off. And in New Zealand, I think it was in New Zealand, there was one of these saucer nests that was actually in swamps where they had crocodiles or alligators or whatever they had. I mean, who's going to be doing that in the middle of a night when you've got crocodiles or alligators around you? It's not real. Clearly, it's genuine, okay? So we do have genuine crop circles, but I do believe, and I have to be honest with you, that let's say 99% of the larger crop formations are done by human hands. But here's the interesting point, is that the guys that make them believe that they are guided to do what they do. They genuinely believe in space aliens or Mother Earth or whatever else that they consider could be guiding them. They have dreams where to put them. When they're actually creating them, they have all sorts of strange experiences. Balls of light will come up to them. They'll see apparitions. They'll have time slips. They'll have healing. They'll feel the energies. So I think what we've got going on here is what I refer to as co-creation. In other words, there is an intelligence, a genuine intelligence behind the crop circle creation, but it needs us. It hasn't got any arms and legs, so it needs us to do its work on its behalf.
The 99% needs us.
Yeah.
Yeah, the 1%
The
doesn't.
physical, yeah. But when I say 99, I mean maybe 98, I don't know. But I don't know. Look, what I'm trying to say is that the vast majority of them are unquestionably man-made. But here's the thing. Some of the most beautiful ones from the early days, let's say 1990, 1991, we still don't know who did them. So it's almost like a Schrodinger's cat, isn't it? You know, it's like is the cat dead or is he alive in the box? It's like, who created the crop circles? Well, until you know exactly who made them, it could be created by aliens or it could be created by humans. And in a way, it's better not to know. It's better just to go into them, experience them, have strange experiences and whatever. You know, in other words, don't question it. I think that eventually I got to the point where I felt the best thing to do is just experience them for what they are, and don't worry about it. Don't worry about who or what made them. Just experience them.
Do you know of any specific crop circle that has no explanation, that's very mysterious, that has no good, that most likely was created not by humans?
It's difficult because obviously they are what I originally referred to as temporary temples. In other words, if you went into a stone circle, for instance, people would have strange experiences. They would feel energies. They would see apparitions, maybe lights or whatever. And when the crop circles appear, that's the same thing, but they only last for a matter of weeks. And then they're ploughed out, and that's the end of them. But what I find interesting is that there was one, and the one to me that the whole booklet was written about it by a guy called John Michel and a co-author, who's an Earth Mysteries researcher and writer, great man, visionary, about one that appeared at a place called Crooked Sole in Wiltshire. And the only reason that we know about this is because somebody happened to be flying over it and they could see the combine harvesters coming towards it. And it was beautiful, it was intricate. And they managed to get some great photographs of it. And even as they were in the air, the harvesters were coming in and taking it out. So if this one guy had not taken those photographs, we would not know about this incredible formation. But the importance of it is that it contained the most incredible numerics relating to cosmic principles and everything. And this was what was written in this book by John Michel, Crooked Sole. There you go. And I mean, look at it. It is like the whole DNA pattern.
Yeah.
Here, the helix. I mean, there's a special term for it. I can't remember what it is.
Fractal toroidal moment.
Yeah. And so, I mean, we would not know about this if it had not been for this one guy that went over it and got these photographs on that day. And you can see the book. There's the Crooked Sole book that John Michel, and who was the other guy that did it with him? Alan Brown, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So this to me is the most fascinating of all of the crop formations, because you think to yourself, why would you do this only for it to be mowed out and never be found? Yeah. And incorporate so much numerics, cosmological principles into that. Now, I'm not therefore saying it was created by aliens, but this is the perfect example of what crop formations are about. For me, they are symbols of transformation.
What about cattle mutilation?
Cattle mutilations, well, that comes back to what we were talking about of these other, brains or parallel universes or, bubble universes interacting with our own. I mean, I've been to Skinwalker Ranch. I was there for a couple of days investigating that. I was there with a film crew. And we certainly know that there you get, cattle mutilations and cattle disappearing at one spot and reappearing inside closed containers and some real weird stuff going on. So what's going on here? Right. It's almost like a poltergeist house, but out in the landscape with cattle mutilations and weird lights being seen. I think that what happens is that there are certain portal locations around the world, of which Skinwalker Ranch is a perfect example, where we do interact with these parallel universes or these otherworldly realms, that these portal locations act as doorways, gateways, and that these intelligences, including, I would say, physical beings, can quite literally then manifest into our world and be here on a temporary basis. Now, that could be a few minutes, a few hours, a few weeks, but eventually they disappear, because I think that what happens is that this parallel universe then shifts apart from our own, and any evidence of its overlap or its overlay is gone. All you've got left is the consequences of that, which would be, in this case, cattle mutilations. And my only explanation for them, if, of course, we see them in terms of a supernatural or an extraterrestrial phenomena, is that we are dealing with beings that quite literally are able to manifest into our physical environment, do this, and then go back from whence they came. And the fact that often when this occurs, you see these mysterious lights at the same time, they, in many ways, are the portal. They are the doorway. And as you probably know, I think, was it Callender, one of the guys that did the Skinwalker Ranch with George Knapp, did all the investigations. They said that they could see these lights, and sometimes they could see through it into other environments. Almost as if they were looking through into another world. So I think that this, if that is generally correct, is an example of these plasma phenomena acting as portals in their own right.
Why do you think they're cutting up the cows and taking, like, surgical, removing their blood and taking organs and all that?
It could be for experimentation and curiosity, but it could be something very similar to the Predator, in the Predator films.
Yeah,
almost like movie. Trophy hunting.
Yeah.
I would not discount that as a possibility.
Yeah, it's hard to. Are they studying our food source? Are they attempting to? Are they going to genetically alter? Are they? Is there something there?
Maybe.
Yeah.
Maybe. Obviously, a lot of UFO abductions also involve.
If you want to get a trophy, you're going to get a lion or a tiger or something, right? A cow's got to be the easiest target for an alien.
Well, it is, but it's not just cows, is it? There's a place in Britain called Bempton in Yorkshire, and a friend of mine, Paul Sinclair, is the main UFO investigator up there. He's written various books, and what he shows is that the mutilations there involve sheep, they involve wild deer, and even porpoises in the sea would wash up with the same type of puncture holes, and the rest of the creature itself would be perfect, other than these bizarre puncture holes.
Uh-huh.
So it's not simply cattle that we're dealing with; it's other types of creatures as well. So who knows? Maybe lions are being mutilated in that way, and we just have never really looked at it that way.
Yeah.
Maybe we just put it down to, poachers or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. What else is interesting within the UAP world now that you're close to or following?
Well, right now it is all this plasma stuff, because what's happened with all the drones and the New Jersey drones, which obviously is something that now is there with, 10 states or more, and it's becoming global,
right,
is that people are beginning to look towards the skies in a way that they've not done in many years. Now, what they're doing is misinterpreting a lot of things. They're misinterpreting aircraft, planets. When I see some of these videos, I think that's the planet Venus or that's an aircraft.
Swamp
clearly,
gas.
Yeah. Clearly they are filming drones. Yeah. There's some very strange drones up there, and we really don't know who they belong to, whether they are part of some kind of black ops, whether they are from some foreign nation, or whether it's just copycat things that people just send in stuff up now just to get a thrill and just to try and get a viral story out of it. We just don't know. But the fact that they clearly are also getting video footage of these orbs. And when we say orbs, I mean, you get the impression of little balls of light. No. These things can be huge. They can be tube-shaped, cigar-shaped. They're ovals. As I said, they often can be seen to have some kind of structure as well. So, that's important. We're not just talking about ball lightning here. We're talking about big objects. And they can appear and disappear. They can, some plasma can be visible, some not. But from plasma comes atomic matter. That's the crucial thing here. And it can be intelligent, and it can create physical environments, basically. So, if they are being powered, if you like, by intelligences, then they have the ability to create virtually what they like, basically. And I think that these scientific papers that have come out over the last year, the fact that I know various documentaries are being made about this subject right now, that this is the next big thing. I mean, plasma is going to be on everybody's mind, basically. And at the conferences, everybody's going to be talking about it. I mean, I've been writing about this for decades. I mean, my book Light Quest came out in 2012. I did a book called Origins of the Gods with my good friend Greg Little. Came out in 2022. It's all about plasma and intelligences. And Robert Temple, the author of The Serious Mystery, but he did a book a couple of years ago called New Science of Heaven. Again, all about plasma and the upper atmosphere, how it can be intelligent. So all of this is contributing to show us that we could be coexisting with a form of life that's been with us since the beginning. I mean, how exciting is that? One of the most incredible discoveries of humanity. That's what interests me right now.
Super cool, man. It would be nice to get some answers. It would be nice because there's so much speculation and there's so many different possibilities for what everybody's seeing and what it might be and what just the nature of reality is around us and what we're surrounded with. And it's the speculation is enough to drive you crazy after enough years of kind of looking into this phenomenon and this topic. I think we're getting closer, though. It seems like we're getting closer. So what about the moon? Do you have thoughts on the moon?
Well, it's not made of green cheese.
Do you think it's a completely naturally occurring structure?
I think so, yeah. I mean, I tend to be quite conventional, unorthodox in my views, unless I see good evidence to the contrary. So, yeah, I do think that it is just a satellite. I mean, I'm not saying that we won't find weird stuff on it.
Yeah.
And also on Mars. I mean, I obviously keep up to date with all of the footage from the rovers that are showing things you think, what the hell is that? And it could be, discarded technology or evidence of intelligence activity. It could be. But until we get up there and look for ourselves, it's always just going to remain a mystery or an enigma, isn't it?
Right.
It's like Phobos, the moon of Mars. There's a huge, great pillar there. There's an even better one on Mars itself. Obviously, NASA and scientists say, it's probably just some kind of meteor that landed or something. But no, they look like proper pillars.
Pull that up, right?
Yeah, look, Phobos. There you go, Phobos monolith. I mean, you can quite clearly see it's there. And it's huge. I mean, look at the shadow that's cast from it. And the Mars monolith, I mean, look at that.
Have they estimated the height of that?
I don't know. But, I mean, it's going to be large, isn't it? I mean, look at the craters around it.
Look at look
at that one on the right here. I mean, that's the Mars one. I mean, that's clearly like a 2001 Odyssey monolith, isn't it?
It is, for sure.
It clearly. I mean, that's the impression that it leaves with you.
Is that the best photo that we have of the Mars monolith?
Yeah.
Really?
I mean, you would think by now they would be over there with the satellites getting much better footage.
Or the rover.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't they get it with the...
I don't know. The trouble is I think that...
300 feet tall on Phobos? Okay. So
which one is it? How
278 feet tall.
Okay, well, it's big, isn't it?
That's a big one, man. What about the Mars monolith?
I don't know. What's it say? Does it say something there?
No, I don't think so.
No. I can't see any actual... but it's big, isn't
16,
it?
16 feet tall.
It's big. So, I mean, all right, yeah, look, it could be natural.
I bet it's bigger than that.
But, I mean, it's tempting, isn't it? It's so tempting to go down there and find out what it is. I mean, I think the problem is that we went there to look at the face on Mars and we got the imagery, and when it came back, it looked terrible. You know, when they went back, the face on Mars.
Yeah, no.
And
it looked terrible because they photoshopped it 15 times and then released the photos. Yeah, it's not a real photograph.
All right. Well,
it's heavily photoshopped.
You know,
the one from 1978 is a very clear image, but the two from 1998 and 2001 are heavily photoshopped.
Okay.
Yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
And NASA is well known for photoshopping. They went way too far in the one in the middle. They realized that. You can see how it's dug out. Yeah. Either that or they brought a bulldozer to Mars, and we don't know about it. But you can clearly see the middle between where the eyes would be and right above the nose, and the nose itself on the 2001 is vertical. It's up in the air, and then you've got a big hole in 1998. It doesn't make any sense unless someone filled that in.
Also, there's a very strong geometrical form with the whole shape anyway.
Yeah, they're a bunch of liars. They're a bunch of...
Well, I mean, obviously, was it NASA? Never a straight answer.
Right, right.
So
definitely don't trust those people.
I mean, look, NASA are definitely changing. They've got their own UAP investigation team. Okay, all right, one last thing then. We talked about multiple dimensions, 11 dimensions. There is a company or corporation in Switzerland called the Blue Brain Project, and their whole idea is to try and transfer consciousness into digital format. And to do this, they have to totally understand how the brain works. I mean, literally how consciousness and the brain functions. And what they have concluded, and this was a headline probably about 10 years ago now, is that the brain operates on 11 dimensions of geometry. And I find that really, really intriguing, because if M theory is correct, that proposes that 11 dimensions exist, then what it means is that we are hardwired to work on 11 dimensions. I mean, it's a little bit like our smartphones, having 5G, this is 5G compatible when we were still on 3G or 4G. Do you know what I mean? It's almost like our brains are ready to be able to connect with multidimensional environments when that opportunity arises. But that also raises the question of, is it possible, therefore, that we are able to communicate with the intelligences that exist within 11 dimensions now through dreams, through visions, through hallucinogenic experiences? And to me, I think that the answer is yes. I mean, we call these entities n-dimensional beings, the n standing for number, because we don't know exactly how many dimensions may be involved, just means number. So we call them n beings or n-dimensional beings. I think that they are the key to everything. I think that they are out there. I think they do interact with us. I think they can communicate with us, through altered states, through dreams, whatever, and definitely through plasma environments. And there are certain places, like Skinwalker Ranch or Mount Gerizim, Bempton in the UK, or any similar UFO hotspot, where communication with these intelligences becomes a lot easier.
Nice. Well, tell everybody one more time, how can people follow you and how can they find you?
Yeah, my website is andrewcollins.com. All my social media links are on there. And there are tons of articles about everything that we've been talking about that you can just click through and link. That's andrewcollins.com. And obviously, I'd like you to check out some of my books. I mean, Light Quest is the one that we were talking about, to do with interacting with plasma intelligences. Also, the last book, wearing my other hat, of course, is Karahan Tepe, Civilization of the Anunnaki, and the Cosmic Origins of the Serpent of Eden. That's it.
Okay.
Publishers like very long titles, I'm afraid. It's meta tags.
A lot of keywords.
Yeah. So yeah, and anything else. And obviously, if you're interested in any of the work I do and want to communicate, there's email links on the website, or obviously just try and contact me, direct message me via social media.
Love it. Very cool, man. Well, I enjoyed it. It's great to talk to you. Great to get to know you today and learn a lot. So we'll do it again.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yep.